5. El Descanso, the rest stop of souls. Miguel Alvarez had never believed in ghosts. In 15 years of hauling freight across the highways of Mexico, he'd heard all the stories, tales of phantom hitchhikers, vengeful spirits, and cursed stretches of road where drivers disappeared without a trace. He'd listened politely to the old-timers at truck stops as they swapped these legends over coffee and cigarettes, but he'd always considered them nothing more than entertainment ways to stay alert during long, lonely nights on the road. The spiritual laws of the highway, his wife Lucia would often say, are never stop where you don't know after sundown. Miguel would always chuckle at her superstition. After all, he prided himself on being practical, a man of reason. Someone who understood that the only real dangers on the road were fatigue, mechanical failures, and reckless drivers. That night, however, would change everything he thought he knew about the world. Miguel had been driving for 16 hours straight, stopping only twice to refuel and gulp down bitter truck stop coffee. Tonight he needed to deliver his cargo to Veracruz before 6 a.m. if he wanted to claim the monthly bonus. Aguila Veloz Transportation was notoriously demanding, but they paid better than any other company on the Mexican long-haul routes, and the extra money meant his daughter could stay in university another semester. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:17 a.m., what old Mexicans called La Hora del Diablo, when the boundary between the worlds of the living and dead was thinnest. The radio had devolved into static hours ago, and he hadn't seen another vehicle in over 30 minutes. The emptiness of the road was starting to get to him, and the monotonous hum of tires against asphalt was becoming a dangerous lullaby. His eyelids grew heavy. He blinked hard, slapped his cheeks, and cranked down the window to let the cool night air shock him back to alertness. It wouldn't be enough. He needed to stop, stretch his legs, splash some water on his face. Just 5 minutes, then he could continue. Just need to find somewhere to pull over, he muttered to himself, scanning the dark highway stretching endlessly before him. That's when he saw it, a flickering neon sign cutting through the darkness like a beacon. El Descanso, rest stop, food, fuel, rooms. The sign swayed gently in the night breeze, its feeble light emanating from a single bulb at the top of the post. Miguel felt a wave of relief. His salvation had appeared just when he needed it most. He signaled, though there was no one behind him to signal for, and turned onto the exit ramp, his heavy rig rumbling as it slowed. The parking lot was pitch black, except for the distant glow from what appeared to be the main building about 50 meters away. Miguel couldn't see if there were other vehicles parked there. He pulled into the lot and cut the engine, plunging himself into near-total darkness, broken only by the dim illumination from his dashboard lights. The silence was immediate and oppressive. Without the constant rumble of the engine that had been his companion for the past 16 hours, the world seemed unnaturally still. He could hear the ticking of the cooling engine, and in the distance the faint rustle of wind through dry branches. 5 minutes, Miguel reminded himself as he grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment. Just 5 minutes to wake up. He climbed down from the cab, his legs stiff from the long hours of driving. The cool night air bit through his thin jacket, causing him to shiver. He stretched, hearing his spine crack in several places. The sliver of moon overhead provided minimal illumination, barely enough to make out the dirt path, leading toward the main building, where a faint light glowed from a single window. As his flashlight beam swept across the parking area, Miguel noticed something odd. The lot appeared to have been abandoned for some time. Cracked concrete with weeds pushing through the fissures, scattered debris, old papers, bottles, even a tire littered the area, as if the place had been forgotten long ago. Strange, Miguel murmured. Signs still lit, though. He headed toward the building where the weak light still spilled from the window. It was a simple single-story structure, likely once a small restaurant combined with a convenience store. As he drew closer, Miguel noticed signs of decay, cracked walls, peeling paint, and what appeared to be a partially collapsed roof section. Maybe I should head back to the truck, he told himself. but his exhausted body demanded relief and his bladder ached painfully. Surely someone must still be here if the lights are on. Suddenly a cold sensation ran down his spine. Not from the night chill, but the distinct feeling of being watched. Miguel whirled around, sweeping his flashlight across the thick darkness behind him, but saw nothing except swaying bushes and deep shadows. He continued walking, his heartbeat slightly elevated now. The 50-meter distance to the building seemed much longer in the darkness. His footsteps crunched on the hard-packed earth, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent night. When he was about 20 meters from the building, Miguel detected a strange smell in the air, the metallic scent of rust mixed with something sweet and nauseating. The smell of blood. His pace slowed, wariness creeping into his mind. The light from the window no longer seemed inviting. It was a sickly yellow glow flickering unevenly like a candle about to die. There should have been sound, a generator, a radio, at least voices talking, but there was only an eerie silence blanketing everything. Suddenly Miguel felt a hand grip his arm from behind. He cried out, spinning around, but saw no one. The sensation 5 cold fingers digging into his arm remained, but there was no person standing behind him. "Don't go any closer," a voice whispered in his ear, though he could see no one. "They just killed the owner." Miguel stood frozen, heart hammering in his chest. Cold sweat broke out across his body despite the cool night air. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Who are you?" No answer came, but the sensation of the invisible hand remained gripping his arm, pulling him back. Then from inside the building a cry for help pierced the silence, followed by the deafening crack of a gunshot. Miguel didn't wait another second. He turned and ran blindly back toward his truck, not daring to look behind him. Each running step felt like he had shadowy pursuers at his heels. He stumbled, scrambled to his feet, continued running, breath coming in ragged gasps, lungs burning. When he reached his truck, he clambered into the cab with a speed he didn't think possible after 16 hours of driving. The key shook in the ignition, the engine roared to life with a deafening growl. Miguel didn't bother with his seatbelt, hit the gas, and the big rig lurched back onto the highway, tires squealing on the pavement. In his rearview mirror, the feeble light from El Descanso diminished and then disappeared, but Miguel didn't dare slow down. Adrenaline coursing through his veins had banished all drowsiness, and he drove at a nearly reckless pace, wanting only to put as much distance as possible between himself and El Descanso. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," he whispered, crossing himself with a trembling hand. His mind raced with questions. What had just happened? Who had grabbed him? Whose voice had he heard? And that gunshot, had he really heard it? Or had his exhausted mind been playing tricks on him? He drove for another hour, the adrenaline eventually wearing off, leaving him shaky but alert. When he finally saw signs for a well-lit, busy truck stop with several other semis parked outside, he nearly wept with relief. He pulled in, parked, and sat in his cab for several minutes, just breathing, trying to make sense of what he'd experienced. Just fatigue, he finally told himself. Just my tired brain conjuring up things that weren't there. But he couldn't shake the feeling of those cold fingers gripping his arm. Miguel made it to Veracruz on time, delivered his cargo, and checked into a reputable hotel where he slept dreamlessly for 12 straight hours. He stayed in the city for 2 days, as was his usual routine before beginning the return journey. This time he made sure to leave early in the morning, determined to cover as much ground as possible before nightfall. As fate would have it, his return route would take him past the same stretch of highway where El Descanso was located, only this time he would be passing it during daylight hours, traveling in the opposite direction. As he approached the area, Miguel felt anxiety building in his chest. Part of him wanted to close his eyes as he passed the exit, but professional instinct kept his gaze steady on the road. When he reached the exit for El Descanso, curiosity overcame fear. He slowed slightly, peering across the highway median to see if he could glimpse the rest stop in the clear light of day. What he saw made his blood run cold. El Descanso wasn't an operational rest stop at all. It was a derelict building abandoned many years ago. The roof had partially caved in. The walls were cracked and covered with faded graffiti. There was no glowing sign, just a rusted metal frame hanging from a broken pole. The parking lot was an overgrown field of waist-high weeds. Miguel pulled into the emergency lane, hands shaking as he reached for his phone. He searched for El Descanso on the map application. No results appeared. It didn't exist on any map. Heart-pounding, he typed El Descanso murder into the search engine. The first result made his skin crawl. Tragedy at El Descanso, family owners slaughtered in bloody robbery, 1978. With trembling fingers, Miguel opened the article. It detailed a brutal massacre in 1978 when a family of 4 who operated the El Descanso rest stop was killed during a late-night robbery. The case was never solved, and the rest stop had been abandoned since then, with no one willing to buy the property after rumors of hauntings began. As he read further, Miguel discovered the part that made his heart nearly stop. The only survivor, a 19-year-old security guard named Manuel Ortega, testified that he had tried to warn a customer not to enter while the robbery was in progress. According to Ortega's statement, he was shot on the spot while trying to prevent the patron from entering and later died from his wounds. His body was found outside in the parking lot. An old photograph accompanied the article, showing a young man in a security guard uniform with a youthful face and a wide smile. Miguel recognized him instantly, the eyes, the hairstyle, despite never having actually seen the person who had warned him. "Please, this can't be." Miguel whispered, his phone slipping from his trembling hands. He retrieved his phone and continued reading. According to locals, the ghost of Manuel still haunts El Descanso, trying to warn passers-by about the tragedy that occurred. Some truck drivers report seeing the rest stop sign illuminated on moonless nights, despite electricity having been cut off decades ago. It is believed that on the anniversary of the massacre, cries for help and gunshots can be heard, as the crime repeats itself in an endless loop. Miguel checked the date on his phone screen, then looked at the date in the article. The night he had stopped at El Descanso was exactly 45 years to the day after the massacre. "Dios mío," he whispered, crossing himself again. He started his truck and drove away, wanting to put as much distance as possible between himself and El Descanso. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, his mind reeling with what he had just discovered. For the remainder of the drive home, Miguel couldn't stop thinking about Manuel Ortega, the man who had died trying to save a stranger. A man who 45 years after his death was still trying to protect travelers on the road. The sensation of the cold hand gripping his arm remained vivid, and now he understood it had been the hand of someone long dead. When he arrived home in Mexico City, Miguel embraced his wife with unusual urgency. He told her the entire story, shaking and including details he thought he had forgotten. Lucia didn't seem as surprised as he expected. Instead, she opened her computer and showed him an article about phantom rest stops along Mexican highways. "They're called paradas fantasmas," she explained. "Places that exist between the boundary of the world of the living and the dead. They only appear on special nights or to special people who are between life and death themselves." "What do you mean?" Miguel asked, feeling a chill. "You had been driving for 16 hours straight, Miguel. You were sleepy, exhausted. If you had continued driving instead of stopping—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Miguel recalled what he had read about Manuel Ortega, the man who had died trying to save a stranger. Now he wondered if Manuel had actually saved him by forcing him to stop when he was too tired to continue driving safely. A month later, during another delivery, Miguel placed a small bouquet of flowers and a candle by the roadside near El Descanso. He didn't dare get too close to the derelict building, but he stood there for a moment, sending a silent thank you to the long-dead man who still kept watch over the road. Since that night, Miguel never drives more than 8 hours without proper rest. He also carries a small talisman, a piece of paper with Manuel Ortega's name in his wallet. And most importantly, he only stops at official, crowded, well-lit rest areas. Wandering souls roam the empty roads, he often tells younger colleagues. Some want to harm you, some want to help you. The trouble is, in the darkness, you never know which kind you're dealing with until it's too late. Some nights, when driving through particularly desolate stretches of highway, Miguel swears he can see the flickering lights of other paradas fantasmas along the roadside rest stops that don't exist in the light of day. And occasionally from the corner of his eye, he thinks he sees a young man in a security guard uniform standing by the roadside, raising his hand in greeting as Miguel drives past. "Thank you, Manuel," he whispers whenever this happens. "Keep watching over the road." Every time Miguel tells this story, he ends with the same warning. Remember, if you're on a lonely road at night and see a rest stop that seems too convenient, too perfect for your needs at that moment, think twice before you stop. It might be a place meant for the living, or it might be a place for those about to join the dead. And sometimes the only difference is whether you heed the warning of the spirits who reach out to save you. They say on certain moonless nights, if you drive that stretch of highway and your eyes grow heavy with fatigue, you might see the flickering neon sign of El Descanso appearing just when you need it most. But whether stopping there will save your life or end it depends entirely on whether you can hear the whispered warning of a long-dead hero still trying to protect travelers from a fate he couldn't escape himself. 4. 3 fallen trees, one voice. Ernesto Vega never believed in anything beyond what he could see, touch, and understand. 40 years behind the wheel, navigating Mexico's treacherous roads from the jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre to the parched Sonoran desert had taught him that careful planning, calculation, and experience were what kept a man alive on the road. 40 years without a scratch, he would proudly tell anyone willing to listen. No accidents, no collisions, not even a flat tire. His colleagues called him El Inmortal, the Immortal One. They said St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, personally watched over Ernesto. He only smiled at such talk. It wasn't saints or luck that had kept him safe through the decades, but pure skill and absolute caution. That late afternoon, as the sun began to kiss the western hills and bathe the sky in brilliant orange, Ernesto was driving along a remote stretch of highway in Michoacan. A green belt of trees flanked both sides of the road, tall pines and ancient oaks forming a natural corridor through which his 18-wheeler moved like a giant beast. A strong gust of wind swept through, shaking the treetops, and Ernesto noticed dark clouds gathering overhead. A storm was coming. The weather forecast hadn't mentioned rain, but after 4 decades on the road, Ernesto trusted what he felt from nature, more than what meteorologists said. "Need to reach Mirador Station before full dark," he muttered, thinking of a familiar stopping point about 2 hours' drive ahead where there was ample room for large trucks and an all-night diner serving legendary pozole. There was something about this stretch of road that made him uneasy. Almost an hour had passed without another vehicle crossing his path, no headlights appearing in his rearview mirror. The radio broadcast more static than music, and even Ernesto's cell phone showed no signal. A feeling of absolute solitude enveloped him, as if the entire world had vanished, leaving only him and his aging truck on this seemingly endless road. Just a quiet stretch, he reassured himself, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling. I've driven through thousands like it. But a deep part of his mind knew there was something different about this road, about this fading afternoon. Darkness began to spread as the sun disappeared completely behind the hills. The truck's headlights cut through the gloom ahead, illuminating only a few dozen meters of road. Ernesto turned up the radio, hoping to find a clear station for some human voices to break the silence, but only static came through, occasionally interrupted by fragments of music and distorted voices he couldn't understand. Fatigue started to creep into his body. It had been over 10 hours since he'd left Mexico City, and despite stopping for lunch, sleepiness was gradually overtaking him. Ernesto knew the danger of driving while tired. It was the silent killer on highways. But he also knew it was just an hour and a half more to Mirador Station, where he could safely rest for the night. Just stay alert a little longer, he told himself, cranking up the radio volume and lowering his window to let the cool evening air keep his mind sharp. His headlights suddenly illuminated an unusual shape ahead. Ernesto narrowed his eyes, trying to identify what it was. As he drew closer, his heart tightened. A large tree trunk lay across the road, completely blocking the first two lanes. "Damn it!" Ernesto cursed, hitting the brakes and activating his hazard lights. The heavy vehicle slowed gradually, and he quickly checked his mirrors to ensure no one was behind him before shifting to the right lane. As he approached the obstacle, Ernesto realized it was an ancient oak, its trunk so thick it would take a crew with chainsaws to move it. The roots still had soil clinging to them, as if it had just been uprooted. There were no signs of road workers or warning signals. "How strange," Ernesto muttered, as he carefully drove past, having to use the emergency lane to avoid collision. Someone should have put up warnings. Once the truck had safely cleared the obstacle, Ernesto reached for his mobile phone in the drawer, intending to report the fallen tree to the highway authorities. But the screen still showed no signal. He sighed, put the phone down, and continued driving, telling himself he would report it when he reached Mirador Station. The sky was now completely dark, not a single star piercing through the thick cloud cover above. Without even the twilight glow to partially illuminate the road, there were only his truck's headlights cutting through the dense darkness. On either side of the road, the trees stood like black, ghostly sentinels, their gaunt branches reaching out like bony fingers. Ernesto felt his eyelids growing heavy. He slapped his cheeks hard, shook his head, took a gulp of cold coffee from the cup in his holder. The drowsiness temporarily retreated, but he knew it would return. The signs were all there: dry, irritated eyes, difficulty focusing, and a heaviness in his head and limbs. "Just one more hour," he told himself. "I can make it." But then through his headlights he saw a familiar shape ahead, a few hundred meters away. Ernesto's heart sank as he recognized what it was: another fallen tree blocking the middle of the road. "Impossible," he muttered, slowing down again. How could there be two fallen trees on the same stretch of road in one night? As he drew closer, Ernesto realized it was a large pine, different from the oak he'd encountered earlier. The tree trunk occupied the first two lanes, forcing him to move to the outer lane. This time, as he passed, branches scraped against the container of his truck, creating a screeching sound that made Ernesto jump. An uneasy feeling rose within him. Two fallen trees in less than half an hour, no signs of rescue teams or warnings, no strong winds or heavy rain to justify this. He had traveled this road dozens of times before without encountering anything similar. "Perhaps a storm swept through this area before I arrived," he reasoned, though not entirely believing his own words. Ernesto decided to increase his speed slightly, wanting to leave this strange stretch of road behind as quickly as possible. But as the speed increased, the sleepiness returned stronger than before. His eyes felt as if sand had been poured into them, and his head nodded despite his efforts to stay alert. "Stay sharp, Ernesto," he scolded himself. 40 years without an accident. Not today." He opened the window fully, letting the cold wind blast his face. He turned the radio louder, despite it being mostly static. He even bit his lip until he tasted blood, all to keep himself awake. But the darkness and the monotony of the road seemed to be hypnotizing him, pulling him into a dreamlike state. Several times Ernesto realized he had closed his eyes for a second, only to jerk awake in panic. "Don't sleep," he said aloud, trying to create sound to keep himself alert. "Don't sleep." The night had now completely enveloped everything, no light source other than his truck's headlights. The feeling of isolation and disconnection made Ernesto recall stories the older drivers used to tell when he was first starting out about haunted roads, stretches of highway where time and space warped, where tired drivers sometimes disappeared entirely. Nonsense, he'd always said, and laughed off such tales. Now alone on this road, memories of those stories came back to haunt him. Ernesto had never been a superstitious man, but he couldn't deny that something very strange was happening. Suddenly, Ernesto felt his eyes close for a bit longer, and when he opened them, he was horrified to realize the truck had drifted into the opposite lane without his awareness. He jerked the wheel back, heart-pounding. "Wake up, you fool," he berated himself. "You'll kill yourself and others." But there were no others on this road, were there? Not a single vehicle in over 2 hours. Just him and his truck and the endless darkness? The sleepiness was now almost irresistible. Ernesto's head nodded, his eyes closing for moments at a time, each time longer than the last. He knew he should stop, find a safe place to pull over and take a short nap. But a part of him, the proud part, the overconfident part, insisted that he could make it, that he could reach Mirador Station safely. 40 years without an accident, he mumbled like a mantra. 40 years without an accident. As Ernesto looked ahead, his blood seemed to freeze. About 50 meters in front of him, a massive tree trunk was falling from the edge of the road into the middle lane. Not already fallen, but falling right now, right before his eyes. The tree crashed onto the roadway with a thunderous sound dust billowing up. The headlights illuminated it, creating bizarre shadows that looked like dark claws reaching toward the truck. Ernesto slammed on the brakes, hands gripping the steering wheel. The truck hurtled forward at high speed, and he knew it wouldn't stop in time. He would have to swerve around it, but how left or right? Each second was precious, each meter critical. In that moment of panic, as Ernesto tried to decide which way to turn the wheel, a voice rang out beside his ear, clear as if someone were sitting right next to him. "Wake up!" Ernesto jerked awake, heart nearly leaping out of his chest. His eyes flew open, realizing he was no longer on the road. The truck had crossed the median, broken through a metal barrier, and was now barreling across a field of wild grass. "My God!" Ernesto shouted, stomping hard on the brakes and trying to control the vehicle. But the wet grass caused the truck to skid several more meters before showing signs of slowing down. Ahead, the terrain abruptly changed. A sheer cliff of vertical drop into darkness. Ernesto knew if the truck went over that edge, no one would survive. In a desperate effort, he wrenched the steering wheel to the left, forcing the truck to turn parallel to the cliff's edge. It responded, but at a cost. The truck plowed straight into a large oak tree at the cliff's periphery. The impact was devastating. Ernesto was thrown forward, the seatbelt cutting into his chest. The windshield shattered, the front of the truck crumpling like a crushed beer can. The screech of tearing metal, the crack of breaking wood, and then a terrifying silence. When the daze cleared, Ernesto realized he was still alive. He shakily unbuckled his seatbelt and tried to open the truck door. It was jammed, and he had to kick it forcefully twice before it opened. Ernesto staggered out, legs trembling, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. He looked back at his truck, the front completely smashed into the oak tree. The tree had been uprooted by the force of the collision and had fallen down onto the highway below, lying across the first and second lanes. Exactly like in the dream, Ernesto limped to the edge of the cliff, exhausted and in pain, to look down at the highway below. About 30 meters down, he could see the oak tree his truck had just hit, lying across 2 lanes of traffic, an exact replica of the scene in his dream. "Impossible," he whispered, hardly believing his eyes. He stumbled back, collapsing onto a boulder. His head spun with what had just happened. He had dreamed of 3 fallen trees, and now in reality 1 tree had actually fallen onto the road below, just as in his dream. And that voice, the voice that had awakened him just in time to save his life, whose was it? Ernesto sat there trembling, not from cold, but from shock, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The truck was severely damaged, unable to continue. His phone still had no signal, and he was stranded here on top of this cliff, at least until dawn. After a while, he found a flashlight in his damaged truck and decided to check if there was any path leading down to the highway. He needed to reach safety, needed to contact someone. As he fumbled in the darkness, Ernesto discovered a steep but passable trail leading down the cliff face. He began carefully descending each step, cautious on the slippery ground. Halfway down the cliff, Ernesto heard the sound of an engine in the distance. A vehicle was approaching. He quickened his pace, hoping to reach the highway in time to flag it down. When Ernesto reached the base of the cliff, he could see headlights approaching along the highway. He hurried toward the road, waving his arms and shouting to attract attention. But then he stopped abruptly. The approaching vehicle was a large truck, very similar to his own. It was moving at an uneven pace, speeding up then slowing down as if the driver were nodding off. A cold sensation ran down Ernesto's spine. He looked back at the oak tree lying across the road, then at the oncoming truck. It was only a few hundred meters from the fallen tree and showed no signs of slowing. Ernesto began running toward the road, waving frantically and shouting, "Stop, fallen tree, stop!" But the truck continued to advance, not slowing down at all. When it was about 50 meters from the tree, Ernesto witnessed a sight that froze him in place. The truck driver was himself, Ernesto Vega, with an exhausted face and half-closed eyes. "Wake up!" Ernesto shouted with all his might, his voice echoing in the night. The driver jerked awake, eyes wide with panic. The truck swerved sharply, avoiding the fallen tree at the last moment, but then careened across the median and disappeared on the other side of the road. Ernesto stood there paralyzed, unable to believe what he had just witnessed. He had just seen himself driving the truck, just witnessed the scene he had experienced only minutes before. Or was he still experiencing it? A loud crash echoed from across the road, the sound of metal impacting wood of a truck hitting an oak tree. The sound was identical to what he had heard when his own truck hit the tree. Ernesto staggered backward, mind reeling. He didn't understand what was happening. Was this some bizarre nightmare? Or had he died in the crash and this was some kind of hell forcing him to relive that moment forever? As those crazy thoughts flooded his mind, Ernesto felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned, and standing there was an elderly man in classic 1970s truck driver attire with a kind but sad face. "Don't worry, amigo," the man said. "It only happens once. No one has to relive that moment forever." "Who are you?" Ernesto asked, voice trembling. "What's happening?" "My name is Carlos," the man replied. "I died on this road in 1978 when I fell asleep and drove off the cliff. Since then, I've been here trying to save others from a similar fate. So I'm dead?" Ernesto asked, throat constricting. Carlos smiled sadly. "No, amigo, not today. I called you awake just in time. You will live once again thanks to your driving skills, not to luck or miracles." Ernesto looked at his hands, then back at Carlos. "So that voice, it was yours?" Carlos nodded. "Yes, some people hear me, some don't. I'm glad you did. But the fallen trees in my dream, and now this real tree." "Sometimes," Carlos said, "the world tries to warn us in ways we don't understand. Dreams, premonitions, strange coincidences, they're not random. You dreamed of 3 fallen trees. The first 2 were warnings. The third would have been your end if you hadn't awakened in time." Ernesto looked toward the cliff where his truck had hit the oak tree. From this position, he could no longer see it. "My truck," he began. "Will be found tomorrow morning," Carlos said, "along with you still alive, though slightly injured. You'll be able to call for help when the sun rises, when phone signals return." "Why is there no phone signal? Why are there no other vehicles on the road?" Carlos smiled mysteriously. "This stretch of road is special on certain nights. Tonight it tried to take your life, but it failed." "Thanks to you," Ernesto said. "Thanks to both of us," Carlos replied. "I can only help those who are willing to help themselves." Ernesto felt a cold wind blow through, and when he looked again, Carlos had vanished. Only he remained alone in the night with the sound of wind rustling through the treetops and insects chirping. Ernesto was never certain whether what happened that night was real or just a trauma-induced hallucination. But when he was rescued the next morning, And when his severely damaged truck was towed up from the cliff, he couldn't help but wonder about the voice that had awakened him just in time. After that night, Ernesto no longer boasted about his 40 years without an accident. Instead, he began telling the story of his invisible friend, the guardian of the night road. He started resting more frequently, never driving when tired. And whenever he passed that stretch of road, he always stopped to place a small bouquet of flowers by the roadside. "Thank you, Carlos," he would say. "Keep saving people like me." And sometimes, just sometimes, he swore he heard a voice answer, "You're welcome, amigo. Drive safely." Years later, when Ernesto finally retired from driving, he made one last trip to that stretch of highway. This time he brought not just flowers, but a small wooden cross which he planted firmly at the spot where he had seen Carlos. On the cross he inscribed, "For Carlos and all the guardians of the road, may your warnings always be heard." As he stood there, an old man now with silver hair, he felt a presence beside him. Though he couldn't see anyone, he knew Carlos was there. "I've been thinking," Ernesto said to the empty air beside him. "That night when I heard your voice and woke up, was it really you who saved me? Or was it me from another time?" The wind whistled through the trees, and for a moment Ernesto thought he heard a chuckle. "Time isn't as linear as we think, amigo," came a whisper on the breeze. "Sometimes we save others, sometimes we save ourselves. The important thing is that we listen when the warning comes." Ernesto nodded, understanding at last. He patched the tiny rift he glimpsed that night in the fabric of reality where past, present, and future had briefly converged, allowing him to become both the saved and the savior. "Goodbye, Carlos," he said. "Or should I say, goodbye, Ernesto." As he walked back to his car, he felt lighter somehow. The mystery of that night would always remain with him, but now he understood its purpose. Not to frighten him, but to teach him that sometimes the voice that saves us comes from where we least expect it, even from ourselves. 3. The uninvited passenger. Hector Dominguez had never liked having his wife accompany him on his long hauls. In his 15 years of truck driving, he had grown accustomed to the solitude of the road, to the rumble of the diesel engine and the quiet nights at remote truck stops. For Hector, the highway was a place for contemplation, a private space he didn't have to share with anyone. But today, his wife Elena had insisted on joining him for the haul to Oaxaca. "I've never seen the South," she'd said as they packed their bags. "And we promised to travel more together. This might not be a real vacation, but at least we'll be together." Hector couldn't argue with that logic. It was true he had promised, and it was true that they rarely had time together with his packed driving schedule and her nursing shifts. So with a resigned sigh, he helped her stow her overnight bag in the cabin of his old but reliable Kenworth. "Just remember, this isn't a sightseeing trip," he warned as they pulled out of Mexico City in the early morning. "I have a schedule to keep. No stopping just to take photos or buy souvenirs." Elena smiled, her warm brown eyes twinkling. "I know, mi amor. I won't interfere with your work. I just want to see what you see every day to understand your life a little better." Hector couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. Maybe this trip wouldn't be as bad as he feared. Perhaps having a companion would make the long hours on the road less monotonous. "But I warn you," he said, voice teasing, "you're the worst co-pilot I've ever had if you fall asleep. That's the worst thing you can do to a truck driver, make them sleepy too." Elena laughed and promised she would do her best to maintain conversation. But as soon as they left the city behind and began their journey along Federal Highway 190 heading southeast, she was lulled to sleep by the steady engine and the rocking motion of the truck. Hector sighed as he looked at his wife dozing in the passenger seat. "Typical," he muttered, but there was no real malice in his voice. Perhaps this was better. He could focus on driving and she would rest until they reached their next stop. The sun gradually moved across the sky as they continued their journey. The landscape changed from crowded suburbs to more rural areas with mountains covered in forests appearing in the distance. Hector turned on the radio, keeping the volume just loud enough to hear but not disturb Elena's sleep. The day transitioned into evening, and Hector calculated they would reach the small town of Nochixtlan by nightfall, where he planned to stay overnight before continuing to Oaxaca the next day. They were on schedule, and despite the slight surprise of having Elena along, everything was proceeding smoothly. As darkness began to fall, Hector switched on the headlights, illuminating the winding road ahead. Coming up was a notorious mountain pass with its sharp curves and steep cliffs. He needed complete concentration to navigate the heavy truck through those turns. "Elena," he gently called, touching her shoulder. "The mountain pass is coming up. You might want to wake up now." But Elena only stirred in her sleep, not fully waking. Hector sighed, returning his focus to the road ahead. He would let her continue sleeping. She'd had an exhausting week at the hospital and clearly needed the rest. As Hector began to enter the mountain pass, he felt the temperature in the cabin seemingly drop. He checked the air conditioning. It was off. Strange. Perhaps it was just the change in altitude. Mountains were always cooler at night. He continued driving, focusing on each curve carefully and cautiously maneuvering the heavy vehicle. It was a dark night. No moon, and the stars were obscured by the tall tree canopies flanking the road. No other vehicles had passed in either direction for at least half an hour, creating the sensation that they were the only people in the world. Suddenly, Elena awoke with a blood-curdling scream. Her shriek tore through the silence of the cabin, causing Hector to jerk violently, nearly losing control of the steering wheel. The truck wobbled dangerously on the narrow road, the right wheel brushing the edge of the cliff for a split second before he regained control. "Dios mío!" Hector exclaimed, heart-pounding. "Elena, what's wrong?" But Elena didn't answer. She continued to scream incessantly, her voice filled with sheer terror. She thrashed wildly in her seat, trying to get away from something. Her eyes were wide with horror, but they didn't seem to see. Hector didn't register that he was calling her name. "Elena, what's happening? Calm down," Hector shouted while trying to maintain control of the truck. He needed to stop, but on this narrow mountain pass there was no safe place to pull over. He had to keep driving until he found a wider section. Elena continued to scream and flail. She kicked her feet, swung her arms, and pounded on the door as if trying to escape from some invisible danger. "Let me out!" she screamed, her voice breaking with panic. "Please, let me out now!" "Elena!" Hector shouted louder, trying to break through the wall of fear enveloping her. "You're in the truck with me. You're safe. Nothing is happening." But his words didn't seem to reach her. Elena kept begging to be released, her voice growing more desperate. Finally, at the next curve, he spotted a small area where he could pull over. It wasn't ideal, just a narrow shoulder, but it was enough for the truck to stop safely. Hector hit the hazard lights and braked hard, the truck groaning as it came to a halt. As soon as the truck stopped completely, he turned on the cabin light and pivoted toward Elena, trying to grasp her hands to prevent her from hurting herself. "Elena, look at me. It's me, Hector. You're in the truck. We're on our way to Oaxaca." But Elena fought harder, trying to break free from his grasp. She cowered into the corner of her seat, pressing herself against the door as if trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and something in the middle of them. Hector looked down at the space between them, seeing nothing but their personal items, a water bottle, snack bag map, and his phone. Nothing frightening, nothing unusual. Yet Elena stared at the empty space between them with abject horror. Her lips trembled and tears began to stream down her cheeks. "What are you seeing?" Hector asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite his racing heart. "Elena, tell me, what are you looking at?" Don't let it touch me," she stammered, voice shaking with fear. "Please, please don't let it touch me anymore." "What? Who?" "There's no one here but you and me, Elena." Hector decided to try a different approach. If she was dreaming or having some kind of hallucination, perhaps he needed to do something to wake her fully. He patted her cheek gently, then a bit harder, though not a slap. "Elena, wake up, you're dreaming," he almost shouted. This time it seemed to have an effect. Her eyes appeared to focus more, and she looked directly at Hector for the first time since her panic began. "Hector," she whispered, voice hoarse. "Yes, it's me," he said, relieved. "You were having a nightmare. Everything is fine." Elena shook her head vigorously. "Not a nightmare. There was a man sitting between us." Hector glanced again at the empty space between them. "Elena, there's no one there." "There was," she insisted, voice breaking. "A man wearing a dirty, torn uniform. He had a wooden mask covering his face." Hector looked once more at the empty seat space between them. "Elena, there is no one here." "Yes," she persisted, voice cracking. "He was wearing a filthy uniform. He had a wooden mask covering his entire face. It was smooth without features, just two black holes where the eyes should be, and a slit for the mouth. And I couldn't see his eyes through those holes, only darkness." Hector felt goosebumps rise on his arms. Elena's description was too detailed, too specific to be an ordinary dream. "Do you think—" He hesitated, unsure what to say. "Do you think it could be some kind of supernatural phenomenon?" Hector wasn't one to believe in ghosts or mystical things. But in this moment, on this lonely mountain road with his wife vividly describing a man he couldn't see, he was willing to consider any hypothesis. Elena nodded slowly. "I don't know what he was, but he wasn't human, Hector, not anymore." "Okay," Hector said, trying to keep calm for both their sakes. "Here's the plan. I'll start the truck and we'll continue to Nochixtlan. You can sit in the back of the cabin if you want, as far from the middle seat as possible." Elena shook her head fiercely. "I can't stay in this truck anymore. I can't." "Elena, we don't have any other choice. We're in the middle of a mountain pass miles from the nearest town. It's not safe for you to stay here alone, and I can't abandon the truck with all the cargo." Hector knew he was putting Elena in a difficult situation, but he truly saw no alternative. They couldn't stay here all night, and there was no taxi or ride service in this remote area. "Just one more hour," he said, trying to reassure her. "1 hour and we'll be in a safe hotel. You can do this." Elena looked at him with tear-filled eyes, then back at the empty space between them. Finally, with a shaky sigh, she nodded. "Okay. Okay. But please drive fast, Hector. As fast as you can." Hector nodded, relieved to have convinced her. He started the engine, and the truck rumbled back to life. The headlights illuminated the dark road ahead as they continued their journey. Elena huddled in the corner of her seat as far from the middle seat as possible, her eyes never leaving the empty space that she believed was occupied by the mysterious stranger. Tense silence enveloped the cabin as Hector drove through the remaining curves of the mountain pass. Each braking, each steering, each small noise from the truck made Elena flinch. She was still pressed against the door, her hands clutching the seatbelt as if it were a lifeline. Hector tried to focus on driving, but his mind kept returning to what Elena had described, a man with a wooden mask and a dirty uniform sitting right beside him. The thought alone sent a chill up his spine. He couldn't help but repeatedly glance at the space between them, though he saw nothing but the empty seat. "Try to think about something else," Hector suggested, attempting to break the tense silence. "Tell me about your day at the hospital yesterday." Elena didn't answer for a long time, so long that Hector thought she hadn't heard him. But finally, in a small, trembling voice, she said, "He's still there. He's watching me." Hector felt a chill run down his spine. "Elena, there's no one there, I swear to you." "You can't see him," she said, her voice even and distant, as if she were speaking from a faraway place. "But I can, and I think he knows that I can see him. What do you think? He is—" Elena swallowed hard. "A soul, someone who died. She paused, shivering. "He doesn't want to be seen. He's angry that I can see him." Hector didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to dismiss everything, tell Elena she was imagining things, that there were no such things as ghosts or souls haunting his truck. But another part, a smaller, deeper part, feared that perhaps she was right. He recalled stories that older truck drivers used to tell about wandering spirits on lonely roads, about people who had died in car accidents and now haunted the stretches of road where they lost their lives. He had always considered those stories mere entertainment ways to pass time during long nights at truck stops, but now, with his wife trembling in fear beside him, those stories seemed to carry a new weight. "Just 40 more minutes," he said, trying to reassure both Elena and himself. "We'll be there soon." Elena didn't respond, her eyes still fixed on the space between them. Hector couldn't help but wonder if she was truly seeing something that he couldn't see, or if this was some form of hallucination brought on by exhaustion. They continued driving in tense silence, with only the rumble of the engine and the sound of tires on pavement breaking the quiet. The mountain pass had finally ended, and they were beginning to descend into the valley where Nochixtlan was located. Occasionally, Hector thought he felt something, a cold sensation, an inexplicable presence, but he quickly dismissed it, attributing it to his imagination being influenced by Elena's fear. As they approached the town, lights gradually appeared in the distance, signaling the return to civilization. Hector felt a bit of relief. Just a few more minutes, and they would be in a safe hotel away from this truck and whatever it was that Elena thought she was seeing. As they neared the town, entering the outskirts where streetlights began to dot the road, Hector noticed a change in Elena. She seemed less tense, her shoulders no longer rigid, and her eyes no longer wide with fear. Instead, she looked confused. "He's gone," she said, sounding surprised. "I can't see him anymore." Hector exhaled in relief. Perhaps whatever it was, it only exists on that mountain pass. Elena nodded slowly, still looking bewildered. "He disappeared as soon as we got close to the town, as if he couldn't leave that stretch of road." When Hector parked at the small hotel he usually used during his hauls, he turned off the engine and turned to Elena. "Are you okay?" She nodded, looking calmer, but still with remnants of fear in her eyes. "I'm sorry about all that. I know you think I was imagining." "No," Hector interrupted, surprising himself. "I don't think you were imagining. I think you saw something, felt something. I don't know what it was, but I believe you." Elena smiled weakly, clearly grateful for his support. "Thank you. It was the scariest thing I've ever experienced." "I felt his cold fingers, Hector. I felt them." She shuddered, and Hector pulled her into a tight embrace. They sat like that for a moment, just holding each other, listening to each other breathe. "So," Hector finally spoke up, trying to lighten the mood, "I guess we can agree this is probably the first and last time you'll accompany me on my hauls." Elena laughed, the sound breaking through some of the remaining tension. "I think so. I'll leave you and your invisible companion to continue alone." They gathered their luggage and entered the hotel, both tired but relieved to have escaped the mountain pass and whatever had frightened Elena so badly. That night, as Elena slept soundly beside him, Hector lay awake pondering what had happened. He wondered if his wife had truly seen a ghost, a soul of someone dead haunting his truck or that mountain pass. He wondered how many times he had driven alone, not knowing there was an invisible passenger sitting right beside him. The thought made him shiver. The next day, as they continued their journey to Oaxaca, Elena was still tense, but no longer panicking as she had been the night before. She had agreed to continue the trip, but had asked to stop at a small church in Nochixtlan before departing, where she had lit a candle and prayed silently. "For the peace of his soul," she explained when Hector asked. "I don't know who he was or why he was in our truck, but I felt he needed peace." Hector nodded once again, impressed by his wife's strength and compassion, even after such a terrifying experience. The rest of the journey proceeded smoothly, with no appearance of any uninvited passengers. Elena still occasionally glanced at the middle seat, but no longer cowered against the door. They arrived in Oaxaca by afternoon, and Hector delivered his cargo on time. Afterward, they decided to spend a day sightseeing in the beautiful city, enjoying the local cuisine, and visiting the historical sites. It was an enjoyable day, and Elena seemed to have forgotten the horror of the previous night, or at least had set it aside. The following day, they began their journey back to Mexico City. Their return route would take them through the same mountain pass, and as they approached it, Hector could sense the tension gradually returning to Elena. "Can we go another way?" she asked, eyeing the mountains ahead. "That would be a long detour," Hector replied. "At least 3 more hours of driving, and I'm not sure it would be a better road for a truck." Elena nodded, accepting the reality that they had to go through the mountain pass once more. "Do you think he'll be there on that road?" "I don't know," Hector admitted. "But if he is, he didn't harm us last time, did he? Perhaps he's just a lost soul trying to find his way home." Elena didn't answer, but Hector could see she was trying to reassure herself that everything would be fine. As they began to ascend the mountain pass, the truck engine roaring as it climbed the steep curve, she gripped his hand tightly. Hector squeezed her hand reassuringly. "It'll be fine. It's just a road, nothing more." But even as he spoke those words, he couldn't help feeling a nervousness of his own. He glanced at the middle seat, half expecting to see a man with a wooden mask looking back at him, but of course there was nothing there, just their bags and water bottles. As they climbed higher, the mountain pass became more winding and treacherous. Fog began to curl around the curves, reducing visibility and forcing Hector to slow down. Elena remained silent, her eyes constantly scanning the cabin but apparently not seeing anything unusual. "I don't see him," she finally spoke, sounding relieved. "Maybe he only appears at night." "Or maybe he only appears when we're going in that direction," Hector suggested. "North to south. Now we're going the opposite way, south to north." Elena nodded, seemingly satisfied with this theory. "I hope so. I don't want to see him again." Hector continued driving, carefully navigating the truck through the narrow curves. The fog was thicker now, sometimes almost completely obscuring the view. He had to rely on fog lights and headlights to see the road ahead. Suddenly, as they rounded a particularly tight curve, Elena drew in a sharp, startled breath. "Stop the truck!" she cried out. Hector, taken by surprise, instinctively hit the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt, the rear wheels sliding slightly on the damp road before finding grip. "What is it? Did you see something?" Hector asked, heart pounding. Elena shook her head, eyes wide, looking ahead. I saw someone by the roadside, right at the curve. I think it was him." Hector peered through the windshield, trying to penetrate the thick fog. At first he saw nothing, but then as his eyes adjusted, he thought he could make out a vague shape by the roadside about 20 meters ahead. "I see something too," he whispered. "Maybe it's just someone walking." "Not on this road." Elena shook her head. "No one walks here." Hector hesitated, unsure what to do. Part of him wanted to floor the gas and drive away as quickly as possible, but another part was curious, wanting to know if this was truly the mysterious man Elena had seen in their cabin the night before. "I'm going to keep driving," he decided. "We'll pass whatever that is. Hold tight, okay?" Elena nodded, but Hector could see she was gripping the seatbelt so tightly her knuckles were white. He released the brake and the truck slowly moved forward, headlights cutting through the fog and illuminating the roadside ahead. As they approached the vague shape, Hector tried to get a better look. And then, just as they passed by, he saw a man standing by the roadside, wearing what appeared to be a dirty uniform with something obscuring his face. Hector drew in a sharp breath, shocked. This couldn't be a normal person. No one would stand alone on this treacherous mountain road, especially in this thick fog. As they passed, the man, or whatever it was, slowly turned his head as if tracking the truck. And although Hector couldn't see the face clearly through the fog, he could have sworn the man was smiling, an eerie, twisted smile visible through a slit in what looked like a mask. And then, as Hector glanced in the rearview mirror, the man raised his hand, waving goodbye. "My God," Hector whispered, You were right. I saw him. He really exists. Elena, still staring straight ahead, not daring to look back, just nodded. What is he, Hector? Why is he there? Why was he in our truck last night? Hector shook his head, having no answers. I don't know. But I think we've passed him now. He's behind us. They continued driving in silence, both too bewildered and frightened to speak further. Only when they had left the mountain pass, when the ground was flatter and the fog had thinned, did they begin to breathe easier. I think we should find out who he is. Elena finally broke the silence. Hector looked at her surprised. You want to know after everything that happened? Elena nodded, determined. I feel like we need to know. Maybe he needs help. Maybe that's why he keeps appearing. Hector wasn't sure he agreed with investigating a restless spirit that may have harassed his wife, but he could see that Elena needed answers, needed closure for her frightening experience. All right, he agreed. When we get back to Mexico City, we'll research that mountain pass. See if there have been any notable accidents or deaths there. Elena nodded, appearing satisfied with this plan. Thank you. And thank you for believing me. About what I saw. Hector took her hand. I'll always believe you, mi amor, no matter what happens. A week later, safely back in Mexico City, Hector and Elena sat before a computer researching the notorious mountain pass on Federal Highway 190. They found numerous reports of car accidents over the years, not surprising for such a dangerous road. But then they found an article from 1987 detailing a serious truck hijacking on that stretch of road. According to the article, a truck driver named Javier Mendoza had been stopped by two highway robbers. They had forced him out of his vehicle wearing masks to avoid identification, and then brutally murdered him. Javier's body was found by the roadside the next day with wounds indicating he had fought fiercely before being killed. Could this be him? Elena whispered, eyes not leaving the screen. Javier. Hector studied the photograph accompanying the article, a young man in a truck driver's uniform with a warm smile and bright eyes. There was nothing frightening about this man. Nothing like the creature Elena had described with the wooden mask and cold hands. Maybe, he said, not entirely convinced. Or maybe it's one of the men who killed him. Elena shuddered. Why would he haunt that road? Why would he get in our truck? I don't know, Hector admitted. Maybe he's looking for help, or maybe he's just lonely. It's been 36 years since he died, if that is him. They read a few more articles about accidents and crimes on that road, but found no definitive answers about the identity of the mysterious man or why he had appeared in their truck. Maybe we'll never know, Elena finally said, closing the web browser. Maybe it doesn't matter. He didn't harm us, whoever he was. Hector nodded, agreeing. I think you're right. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But the next time Hector had to make a haul to Oaxaca, he found himself wondering if he was truly alone in the truck. And when passing through that mountain pass, he always felt a presence beside him, a vague sense that someone or something was sitting in the passenger seat that he couldn't see. Sometimes, in his peripheral vision, he thought he saw a movement, a shadow, a vague shape. But when he turned his head to look, there was nothing there. Is that you, Javier? He would often whisper into the quiet cabin. Or perhaps you're the one who killed him. There was never an answer, only silence, and sometimes, if he listened very carefully, the whisper of the wind through the window crack sounding almost like a sad sigh. And every time he passed that particular curve where they had seen the man by the roadside, Hector always glanced in that direction. Most of the time there was nothing. But occasionally, on particularly dark nights when the fog rolled thick around the curves, he thought he could see a figure standing there. And every time he drove past, that figure would raise its hand, waving goodbye. As years passed, Hector continued his route, sometimes with the ghostly passenger, sometimes alone. He never knew why the spirit had chosen his truck that night, or why Elena had been able to see it when so many others couldn't. But he did know that the roads of Mexico held more mysteries than most people realized, and that sometimes the line between the world of the living and the dead was as thin as the white paint marking the edges of a mountain highway. The roads remember, he would tell younger drivers. They remember every life lost on them. And sometimes, if you're driving late at night alone on a mountain pass with no other cars around, sometimes you might feel a cold spot next to you, or catch a glimpse of someone sitting in your passenger seat from the corner of your eye. If that happens, don't be afraid. Just nod and say, "Buen viaje, amigo," safe travels, friend. Because all lost souls are just trying to get home, even if they don't remember where home is anymore. 2. The price of solitude. I never believed in luck. Luck is something weak people cling to when they're too lazy to control their own destiny. So when I decided to hitchhike across Mexico with nothing but a backpack, a few hundred pesos, and no concrete plan, I didn't call it luck. I called it freedom. My name is Alejandro, but most people call me Alex. At 22, I was sick of my mundane life in Mexico City, the soul-crushing office job, the relationship that had run its course, and the feeling that life was passing me by while I'd never truly lived. So on a Monday morning, I gave it all up. Quit my job via email, sent a breakup text to my girlfriend, and packed only the barest essentials into my old backpack. My destination was the northern border, a journey of nearly 3,000 kilometers from Mexico City to Tijuana. No car, no plane or bus tickets. Just my thumb, my patience, and my belief that the road would provide. The first 2 days were easy. I hitched rides from the city to Querétaro, then from there to San Luis Potosi. Kind drivers, interesting conversations, and the feeling that adventure was unfolding before me. But by the third day, things started getting more difficult. I was stuck at a remote intersection outside San Luis Potosi for nearly 4 hours under the scorching sun until an elderly couple finally stopped and offered me a ride to Zacatecas. They were wonderful people, treating me to lunch and sharing stories about their youth. But when we reached a fork in the road, they turned west while I needed to continue north. "Be careful, hijo," the woman said as I climbed out. "It's not safe to stand alone by the road, especially after dark." I smiled and thanked her for the advice, though inwardly I dismissed it. I'd read all the travel blogs, knew all the safety tips for hitchhiking. I wasn't naive. As they drove away, I stood by the roadside, thumb extended, hoping another vehicle would stop. But as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, my hope started to fade. Vehicles became scarcer, and those that did pass didn't even slow down. I surveyed my surroundings, assessing the situation. I was standing at a desolate junction where the main road met a smaller one leading into a sparse forest. There were no houses or stores in sight, just arid fields stretching out on one side and the thin forest on the other. As darkness began to fall, I started to feel anxious. Not scared, I would never admit to that, but realistic. Being out on the road alone at night wasn't a good idea. "Just one more car," I told myself, looking down the empty road. "Just one more kind soul." But as the last rays of sunlight disappeared from the sky and darkness enveloped the landscape, I had to face the reality that I might have to spend the night here. I had a small tent in my backpack, and I began considering setting it up at the forest's edge, just far enough from the road to not be seen yet not too deep into the woods. As I was weighing my options, a sound made me turn the engine of a vehicle approaching from the distance. I spun around and saw headlights advancing from the direction I had come from. My heart beat faster with renewed hope. This could be my last chance to avoid an uncomfortable night outdoors. I quickly positioned myself in a visible spot, thumb held high, trying not to look too desperate. The approaching vehicle was a large truck, an 18-wheeler. Normally, I preferred smaller vehicles because they felt safer, but at this point, I didn't have many options. The truck slowed as it neared me, brake lights illuminating the darkness. I felt relief wash over me as it came to a complete stop a few meters away. The cabin towered above me, and I had to look up to see the driver. The door opened, and an older man looked down at me. His face was hard to read in the dim light, but his voice was friendly. "Where you headed, muchacho?" he asked. "Anywhere north," I replied, trying to sound polite and not desperate. "I'm making my way to the border." The man nodded slowly. "I'm heading to Durango. You can ride along if you want." Durango, about 300 kilometers to the northwest. Not exactly the direction I wanted to go, but certainly better than staying here overnight. I nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, sir, that would be great. Thank you so much." "Climb up," he said, opening the door wider. "It's not safe to be out on the road alone at night." I quickly climbed into the cabin, grateful to escape the darkness and have transportation. I placed my backpack on the floor between my feet and sat down, feeling the tension in my body ease. "Thank you very much," I said again. I was starting to think I'd have to camp right here. The man started the engine and began driving, not looking over at me. "Your friend not coming with you?" I blinked, confused. "What friend? I'm traveling alone." The driver continued looking straight ahead, his expression unchanged in the dim light from the dashboard. "The girl standing next to you, she's not coming along." An icy chill ran down my spine. There was no one standing next to me. I've been standing alone for hours. The driver shrugged as if I'd said something inconsequential. Must have been my eyes playing tricks. But I couldn't let it go so easily. "You said you saw a girl standing next to me. What did she look like?" He glanced at me, his expression inscrutable in the dim light. "You really didn't see her, young woman, probably about your age. White long dress, black long hair, standing right beside you when I stopped." I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. "No, there was nobody there." The driver didn't seem too concerned. "Maybe the headlights fooled me. I've been driving all day. Eyes aren't as good as they used to be." I tried to accept that explanation, but an uncomfortable feeling lingered. I looked around the cramped truck cabin as if I might find the mysterious girl hiding somewhere, but there were only me, the driver, and the rumbling engine. "My name's Victor, by the way," the driver said after a moment of silence. "And you are?" "Alex," I replied, trying to shake off the strange feeling. "Nice to meet you, Victor." "Have you been driving trucks long?" "Over 30 years, he answered, seeming pleased to be asked about his profession. "Been all over this country, from Yucatan to Baja. Seen just about everything on these roads." "Like invisible girls?" I attempted to joke, though my voice sounded strained even to myself. Victor didn't laugh, just kept his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. "I've seen many things I can't explain, young man. The roads of Mexico hold many secrets, especially at night." I wasn't sure how to respond, so I just nodded and looked out the window. Outside, the landscape passed by in darkness, shadowy hills, glimpses of trees, and occasionally the faint light of a distant house. The road stretched ahead, illuminated by the truck's headlights, looking like a tunnel through the night. "So, why are you heading to the border?" Victor asked after a moment of silence. I shrugged. "I need a change. Want to see new places, maybe cross into the States if I get the chance." "Running from something?" The question caught me off guard. "Not exactly, just, looking for something different." Victor hummed, not sounding entirely convinced. "Everybody's either running from something or running to something. Nobody's just changing." I didn't want to admit he might be right, so I changed the subject. "Do you often pick up hitchhikers?" Victor shook his head. "Rarely. Too dangerous these days. A lot of bad people on the roads. But sometimes I feel a nudge, like tonight. I saw you standing there and something told me to stop." "The girl?" I couldn't help asking. Victor glanced at me again, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Maybe, or maybe just an old man's intuition. Who knows?" We drove in silence for a while. I tried to keep the conversation going to avoid thinking about the mysterious girl Victor thought he had seen. "Do you have a family?" I asked. A flicker of sadness crossed Victor's face. "Used to." "My wife passed 10 years ago. Cancer. Our daughter lives in Monterey with her family. I visit occasionally, but the road is my home now." "I'm sorry about your wife," I said, genuinely feeling for him. "Life goes on. Victor said with quiet acceptance. "We all have people we've lost. Some of us are just better at letting go." There was a wisdom in his simple statement that made me reflect. I thought about what I'd left behind in Mexico City, a job I didn't really hate, a relationship I perhaps hadn't tried hard enough to save, a life that might not have been as bad as I'd convinced myself it was. "I guess so," I murmured half to myself. Victor looked out his side window as if observing something in the darkness. Sometimes the things we leave behind don't want to be left. Before I could ask him what he meant, Victor suddenly braked, jerking me forward, the seatbelt cutting into my chest. I looked ahead, searching for the reason for the abrupt stop, but the road ahead was clear. "What is it?" I asked, heart beating faster. "Why are we stopping?" Victor didn't answer immediately. He was looking out his window into the darkness outside. I followed his gaze but saw nothing except blackness and the vague outline of wild shrubs. "Victor," I called, anxiety beginning to rise. "She's still there," he said quietly, almost whispering. "The girl. She's running alongside the truck." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. I stared out the window, trying to penetrate the darkness, but saw nothing. "There's no one there," I said, my voice cracking. "She's crying," Victor continued as if he hadn't heard me. "Look, she's trying to say something." Despite knowing I would see nothing, I couldn't help looking out my window. Outside, the darkness was as thick as ink, broken only by the headlights beaming ahead. No girl, no one at all. "Victor, we should keep going," I said, feeling cold sweat trickle down my spine. "There's nobody there." But Victor had already opened the truck door. "I'll see what she needs." "No!" I nearly shouted. "Don't! There's no one there. Let's just go." Victor paused, the door half open, and looked at me with an odd expression. "What are you afraid of, young man? You said you don't see anything." I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain that although I saw nothing, his absolute conviction that there was a girl outside terrified me more than anything I'd ever experienced? "I don't." I began, but the words caught in my throat as I looked over Victor's shoulder out the open door. There was movement in the darkness, a vague shape, a flash of white. And then I saw her, a young woman standing a few meters from the truck, a shadowy figure in the night. Her white dress fluttered slightly in the breeze, though I felt no movement of air. Her long black hair fell past her shoulders, and her face, I couldn't make out her face clearly in the darkness, but I could see she was crying, tears glistening like silver in the moonlight. "Oh my God," I whispered, frozen with fear. "Now you see her, don't you?" Victor asked softly. I couldn't speak, just nodded mechanically. Victor turned back to look at the girl, his voice gentle, as if speaking to a frightened child. "What do you need, Nina? Why are you following us?" The girl looked toward us, her large dark eyes sad and mournful. Her lips moved as if saying something, but no sound came out. "I can't hear you, Nina," Victor said, his voice still gentle. The girl slowly raised her hand, pointing in the direction we had come from. Then, with a sudden movement that made me flinch, she turned and began running back along the road. "She wants us to follow her," Victor said, closing the truck door. "Follow her," I repeated, my voice barely audible. "Follow a ghost." Because that's what she had to be, right? There was no way a real girl would be out here in the middle of nowhere running alongside a truck in the darkness. "Come on," Victor said, opening his door and stepping down from the cabin. "Wait," I called, panic rising. "Where are you going?" "To follow her," he said simply. "She needs help." I sat frozen, watching as Victor walked toward the back of the truck and then into the darkness beyond the reach of the headlights. I could hear his footsteps crunching on the gravel, gradually fading away. I didn't want to follow. Every instinct told me to stay in the truck, to lock the doors, maybe even to climb into the driver's seat and drive away. But I couldn't leave Victor out there alone, and despite my fear, a morbid curiosity pulled at me. What did the girl want to show us? With trembling hands, I unfastened my seatbelt and opened my door. The night air was cool against my sweat-dampened skin. I climbed down from the cabin on unsteady legs and looked around. I could just make out Victor's figure heading into the darkness, following a faint white shape that had to be the girl. The moonlight was just enough to prevent me from losing sight of them completely. "Victor!" I called, hurrying after him. "Wait for me!" I jogged to catch up, my heart pounding in my chest. The girl seemed to float rather than walk, her white dress gleaming eerily in the darkness. She was leading us away from the road toward a dense patch of trees I hadn't noticed before. "Where is she taking us?" I whispered to Victor when I caught up to him. "I don't know," he replied, eyes fixed on the ghostly figure ahead. "But she's insistent." We followed her into the tree's branches, scratching at our faces and arms. The girl seemed to pass through the foliage without difficulty, while we had to push our way through. After about 50 meters of this difficult progress, we emerged into a small clearing. The girl stood in the center, pointing down at something. In the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, I could make out a dark shape on the ground. Victor pulled out a flashlight from his pocket, something I hadn't noticed he had, and shined it on the spot where the girl was pointing. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was a car, an older model, partially hidden by underbrush, as if it had been there for some time. The front was crumpled against a tree, the windshield shattered, and inside— "Oh, God!" I gasped, turning away. Inside was the body of a young woman slumped over the steering wheel. She wore a white dress, now stained dark with what could only be blood. Her long black hair covered her face, but there was no doubt she was dead. I looked back at the ghostly girl who had led us here. She stood beside the car, tears still streaming down her face, looking at the body, at herself with infinite sadness. "We need to call the police," Victor said, his voice remarkably calm. He pulled out his phone, and to my surprise he had signal. As he dialed, I couldn't take my eyes off the ghost girl. She raised her head, looking directly at me, and mouthed something I couldn't understand. Then, like mist dispersing in the morning sun, she slowly faded away, leaving only the wrecked car and its grim contents. The police arrived 40 minutes later, their lights cutting through the darkness of the forest. Victor and I had waited by the road, neither of us wanting to stay near the wrecked car any longer than necessary. The officers took our statements, their faces growing increasingly skeptical as we explained how we had found the car. "So you're saying you followed a ghost?" one officer asked, eyebrow raised. Victor answered before I could. "We saw a young woman in distress, officer. We followed her." How were we to know she was no longer of this world? The officers exchanged looks but continued their questions. Eventually they called in a forensics team and a coroner. Hours later, as dawn was breaking, a detective approached us. "The victim appears to have been dead for about 24 hours, he said. "Her ID identifies her as Marisol Hernandez, 21 years old, from San Luis Potosi. She was reported missing yesterday when she didn't arrive at her sister's house in Zacatecas. The name meant nothing to me, but the timing sent a chill down my spine. 24 hours ago, that would have been around the time I was standing at that intersection waiting for a ride." "Was it an accident?" Victor asked. The detective's face darkened. "We don't think so. There are signs of a struggle, and the crash doesn't account for all her injuries. We believe she may have been the victim of foul play." As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows through the trees, the police continued their work. Victor and I were told we would need to go to the station to give formal statements, but that it might be several hours before they were ready for us. We sat in Victor's truck, neither of us saying much. The events of the night had left me drained, my mind struggling to process what I had seen. A ghost had led us to her own body. A young woman murdered and left to be forgotten in the forest. "Why did she come to us?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. Victor gazed out at the police activity around the forest's edge. Perhaps she needed someone to find her, to make sure her family knew what happened to her. But why us? Why not appear to the police directly? "Spirits have their own rules," Victor said with the certainty of someone who had given this much thought. Perhaps she could only appear to those who were near where it happened. A thought struck me. That intersection. That's where I was waiting when you picked me up. That's where you saw her standing next to me. Victor nodded slowly. I believe that's where she was taken, where her journey ended and her spirit began wandering. I shuddered thinking about how I had stood for hours at the very spot where a young woman had likely been abducted, possibly killed. Had her spirit been standing beside me the entire time, invisible to me but desperate for help? Had other drivers seen her too, and that's why they hadn't stopped for me? As the morning wore on, more police vehicles arrived. News vans parked along the roadside, reporters setting up cameras. The case of Marisol Hernandez was becoming a media event. Victor and I were eventually taken to the police station in separate cars. As I was about to leave, Victor pulled me aside. "Whatever you do," he said in a low voice, "don't tell them about seeing her ghost. Just say we saw a woman in distress by the roadside and followed her into the woods." Once we found the car, she ran off too traumatized to stay. I nodded, understanding. The truth would only complicate things and possibly make us suspects rather than good Samaritans. At the police station, I gave my statement as Victor had suggested. The detectives seemed satisfied, though they did question why I was hitchhiking alone at night in such a remote area. I explained that I hadn't planned to be there after dark. It had just worked out that way. Hours later, when I was finally released, I found Victor waiting for me in the station's lobby. "They're letting you go too?" I asked, surprised. He nodded. "They have no reason to hold us. We're witnesses, not suspects." As we walked out of the station, the afternoon sun harsh after hours under fluorescent lights, Victor turned to me. "I'm still heading to Durango," he said. "You're welcome to continue with me if you want." I hesitated. After what had happened, the thought of getting back in that truck, continuing the journey as if nothing had occurred, felt wrong somehow. But the alternative was staying in this town where I knew no one, with very little money and a ghost story I couldn't tell. "Thank you," I said finally. "I'd appreciate the ride." We climbed back into his truck, the familiar rumble of the engine now somehow comforting rather than ominous. As Victor pulled onto the highway, I noticed he glanced repeatedly in his rearview mirror. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "No," he said quietly. "I'm just checking to see if she's following us." I turned to look out the back window, half expecting to see the ghostly figure of Marisol running behind the truck. But there was only the empty road stretching back toward the town. "I don't see her," I said, relieved. "Good," Victor replied. "That means she's at peace now. Her body has been found. Her family will know what happened to her. Justice might be served." We drove in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. The landscape changed from forest to more open terrain, mountains visible in the distance. "Do you think—" I began hesitant to ask. "Do you think she was trying to warn me by appearing at that intersection?" Victor considered this. Perhaps, or perhaps she was just seeking someone who could help her, someone who would follow her ghost to her body. But why appear to me if I couldn't see her? Why not just appear to you directly? Victor was quiet for a moment. "Some spirits can only be seen by certain people, those with a particular sensitivity, or perhaps—" He paused. "Perhaps she tried to warn others before you, but they ignored her or fled in fear." The thought that I might have been just one of many who had encountered Marisol's ghost was unsettling. How many others had stood at that intersection, seen or unseen her, and then continued on their way oblivious to the tragedy that had occurred there? As the day wore on, we stopped at a roadside diner for a late lunch. The news was on a television in the corner, and I wasn't surprised to see Marisol's case featured prominently. Her photo showed a beautiful young woman with a bright smile, so different from the sad, spectral figure we had followed into the woods. "They're saying she was the 5th young woman to disappear in that area in the past 2 years, Victor said, nodding toward the TV. "The others were never found." A chill ran through me. You think there's a serial killer operating in that region? Victor's face was grim. It seems likely. And if there is, you were in grave danger standing alone at that intersection. I felt sick. If Victor hadn't stopped for me, if I had accepted a ride from someone else, or worse, if the killer himself had offered me a ride, I might have ended up like Marisol, another body hidden in the woods. Maybe that's why she appeared to me, I said softly. Not just to lead someone to her body, but to save me from her fate. Victor nodded slowly. The dead sometimes try to protect the living, especially from dangers they themselves faced. We finished our meal in silence, the weight of this realization heavy on both of us. When we returned to the truck, I noticed Victor checking underneath it and looking carefully in the cargo area before we continued. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Just being cautious," he replied, "making sure no one has tampered with anything while we were inside." As we drove on toward Durango, I found myself thinking about the life I had so cavalierly abandoned in Mexico City. The job that had bored me but paid my bills. The girlfriend who would love me despite my restlessness. The family who would be worried sick if they knew where I was and what I had experienced. "Do you think she regretted it?" I asked suddenly. "Who?" "Marisol. Do you think she regretted whatever decisions led her to that intersection? To being alone on that road?" Victor considered this. "I don't know, muchacho, but I do know that most of us at the end wish we had valued what we had more than what we thought we wanted." His words struck something deep within me. I had thrown away security and connection in pursuit of freedom and adventure. But was it worth it? Was the price of solitude too high? As evening approached, we finally reached the outskirts of Durango. Victor would be dropping me off soon, and I would once again be on my own thumb, extended, hoping for kindness from strangers. "Where should I leave you?" Victor asked. I hesitated. "Actually, I think I might try to find a bus station. Maybe take a bus back to Mexico City." Victor glanced at me, a knowing look in his eyes. "Changed your mind about the border?" "I think so," I said quietly. "There are things back home I need to reconsider." He nodded, seeming to understand without requiring further explanation. "There's a central bus station downtown. I'll take you there." At the bus station, as I was about to climb down from the truck, Victor handed me a small medallion. "What's this?" I asked, examining the silver pendant featuring St. Christopher. "Patron saint of travelers," Victor explained, "for protection on the road." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched, "for everything. Remember what you learned tonight, muchacho," he said seriously. "The roads of Mexico are full of spirits. Some want to harm you, some want to help you, but none of them appear without reason." I nodded, tucking the medallion safely into my pocket. As I shouldered my backpack and was about to close the truck door, a question that had been nagging at me finally found voice. "Victor," I asked, "how did you know to look for her in the forest? She pointed back along the road, but you led us straight to that clearing as if you knew where to go." Victor's face remained impassive. "She guided us. But she was in front of us. She never indicated to turn into those specific trees." Victor looked at me for a long moment, his eyes suddenly seeming much older and sadder than I had noticed before. "Some things are better left unexplained, Alex," he said finally. "Just be grateful you're alive to ask such questions." With that cryptic response, he closed the door and drove away, leaving me standing at the bus station with far more questions than answers. That night, as I waited for the midnight bus to Mexico City, I searched online for information about Marisol Hernandez's case. The articles confirmed what we had been told. She was the fifth young woman to disappear in that area. Police were investigating possible connections between the cases. Then, almost as an afterthought, I searched for truck driver serial killers Mexico. The results made my blood run cold. Several cases had been documented over the years of truck drivers who preyed on hitchhikers and lone travelers. One case in particular stood out: a driver who had operated in central Mexico in the 1990s, targeting young women at remote intersections, offering them rides, and then taking them into forested areas where he killed them. The driver had never been caught. With trembling fingers, I opened an image search. Most of the photos were of police sketches or crime scenes. But one photo from a 1995 newspaper article showed a suspect being questioned and released due to lack of evidence. Though 30 years younger, the face was unmistakable. Victor, I dropped my phone as if it had burned me. My mind raced trying to process this revelation. Had I spent the last 24 hours with a serial killer? Had the ghost of one of his victims led us to her body in a twisted attempt at justice or exposure? But that made no sense. If Victor was the killer, why would he help find Marisol's body? Why draw attention to his crimes, unless he wasn't her killer at all? I picked up my phone again, searching more carefully. The truck driver killer from the 1990s had eventually been identified as Victor Mendez, who had died in prison in 2005 while serving time for an unrelated offense. The Victor I had met couldn't be the same man. He looked similar, yes, but it wasn't him. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. If my Victor wasn't the killer, then who was he? And why had he seemed to know exactly where to find Marisol's body? As I boarded the midnight bus back to Mexico City, these questions continued to haunt me. I clutched the St. Christopher medallion in my pocket, no longer certain if it was a token of protection or something far more sinister. I never saw Victor again. Once back in Mexico City, I returned to my old job. Thankfully, they hadn't replaced me yet, reconciled with my girlfriend, and tried to put the entire experience behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about Marisol's ghost and the mysterious truck driver who seemed to know too much. I wonder about the other missing women, if they too wander the lonely intersections of rural Mexico, invisible to most, desperately seeking someone who can see them, someone who can lead authorities to their remains and bring their killers to justice. And I wonder about Victor. Was he merely a good Samaritan with an uncanny intuition? Or something else entirely, perhaps another kind of spirit? One who walks the roads looking not for victims, but for the lost souls of those already taken? I'll never know for certain. But one thing I do know: I will never hitchhike again. The price of solitude on Mexico's haunted highways is far too high to pay. 1. The third passenger. There's a stretch on the Mexico-Tuxpan highway where the road straightens out for several kilometers. On some days you can drive for hours and see hardly any other vehicles. At night you see even fewer. I've been driving an 18-wheeler for over 25 years, and before that night I had only been on that highway a couple of times. My name is Raul Fuentes, and this is my story. It was well past midnight. The straight road ahead seemed endless, stretching toward the horizon like a black ribbon cutting through the darkness. I was tired, but knew I'd soon reach my destination. The radio transmitter crackled with static, the usual chatter of fellow drivers, notably absent at this late hour. It was just me, my aging freightliner, and the vast emptiness of the Mexican highway. I've heard all the stories truckers tell each other at rest stops. Tales of phantom hitchhikers, cursed stretches of road where drivers disappear without a trace, and ghostly apparitions that cause fatal accidents. I never believed any of them. 25 years behind the wheel had taught me that the real dangers on the road were fatigue, mechanical failures, and reckless drivers, not supernatural entities. That night, however, would change everything I thought I knew about reality. The cab was warm despite the cool night outside. I had the window cracked open just a bit to keep fresh air circulating, helping me stay alert. The headlights illuminated only a small portion of the road ahead, the darkness beyond seeming to swallow the light. There hadn't been another vehicle in either direction for at least 45 minutes. I reached for my thermos, taking a swig of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. The bitter taste made me grimace, but the caffeine was necessary. Just a couple more hours to go. Suddenly a voice broke through the static of the radio transmitter. Attention all drivers on Mexico-Tuxpan kilometer 157. There's a large pothole, no more like a sinkhole, opened up in the middle lane. Nearly lost control. Be careful if you're heading that way. I straightened in my seat, immediately more alert. I checked my GPS. I was approaching kilometer 150. The warning had come at the perfect time. This is Raul, at kilometer 150, headed north. Thanks for the heads-up, companero. I'll be on the lookout. I responded into the transmitter. There was no reply, just more static. But I was grateful for the warning. Sinkholes were no joke when you're hauling 18 wheels and several tons of cargo. I reduced my speed and turned up the brightness of my headlights, scanning the road ahead more carefully. Sure enough, about 7 kilometers later, my headlights illuminated a gaping hole in the center lane. It wasn't just a pothole, this was a proper sinkhole, at least a meter wide, and who knows how deep. If I'd hit that at full speed, it could have been catastrophic. I carefully steered around it, my heart rate picking up, as I realized how close I'd come to a potential disaster. Once safely past, I picked up the transmitter again. To the driver who warned about the sinkhole at kilometer 157, gracias, amigo. You may have saved my truck and my life. Again, no response came through. Perhaps he was out of range now or had switched off his radio. Either way, I silently thanked him as I continued on my journey. About an hour later, I pulled into a small gas station to refuel. As I stood watching the numbers tick up on the pump, another truck pulled in. An older model Kenworth, well-maintained but showing its age. The driver stepped out, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache and weathered skin that spoke of decades on the road. As we nodded to each other in the way that fellow truckers do, a flash of recognition crossed his face. "Were you on the Mexico-Tuxpan earlier?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Were you the one who warned about the sinkhole?" He smiled and extended his hand. "Diego Herrera. And yes, that was me. Nearly wrecked my rig hitting that thing. Figured I'd warn others." "Raul Fuentes," I said, shaking his hand firmly. "You saved me from a nasty accident. Let me buy you a coffee." Diego accepted, and we walked to the small convenience store attached to the gas station. As we sipped our coffees, we exchanged the usual trucker talk routes, companies' cargo complaints about regulations and road conditions. Diego had been driving for over 30 years, mostly the northern routes. He knew every pothole, every dangerous curve, every corrupt police checkpoint from Mexico City to the U.S. border. "That stretch of the Tuxpan Highway," I said, "it's strangely empty at night, isn't it?" Diego's expression changed subtly. "Most locals avoid it after dark." "Why's that?" He shrugged suddenly, seeming uncomfortable. "Superstition. You know how it is in the small towns. They say the road is haunted." I chuckled. "Let me guess. Phantom hitchhikers, ghostly apparitions." Diego didn't smile back. "Something like that." Before I could press further, he checked his watch and stood up. "I should get back on the road. Got a delivery in Poza Rica by morning." "I'm headed that way too," I said. "Maybe we'll see each other again on the road." Diego nodded, but something in his expression seemed off. Almost worried. "Maybe. Drive safely, Raul, and keep your eyes open. Not everything on the road is what it seems." With that cryptic warning, he paid for his coffee and left. I finished my own drink, slowly wondering about Diego's strange behavior and his reluctance to discuss the supposedly haunted highway. Just another old trucker with too many superstitions, I thought. After 25 years on the road, I'd met plenty like him. I returned to my truck, checked the tires and cargo one last time, and got back on the highway. The night had grown deeper, the darkness more intense. My headlights seemed to penetrate less of the blackness ahead, as if the night itself had thickened. The road remained deserted. No cars, no trucks, not even the distant glow of headlights on the horizon. Just the endless, straight road and the star-filled sky above. I turned on the radio, hoping to find some music to keep me company, but found only static across all stations. Even my cell phone showed no signal. It was as if this stretch of highway existed in some kind of dead zone, cut off from the rest of the world. About 30 minutes after leaving the gas station, I spotted headlights in my rearview mirror. They were far behind but steadily approaching. As they drew nearer, I recognized the distinctive shape of Diego's Kenworth. He must have left the station shortly after me. I felt an odd sense of relief at seeing another vehicle on this desolate stretch of road. Even though we weren't traveling together, there was comfort in knowing another human was nearby in this vast emptiness. Diego's truck stayed behind me for several kilometers, maintaining a consistent distance. I wondered why he didn't overtake me, as his truck seemed capable of greater speed than mine. Perhaps he was being cautious after the sinkhole incident. As we continued down the straight highway, something strange began to happen. The temperature in my cab dropped noticeably. I checked the air conditioning. It was off. The window was still cracked open, but the night air shouldn't have been this cold. A shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I felt watched, as if something other than Diego's headlights was following me. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to fatigue and the eerie emptiness of the road. Then I noticed something odd. Diego's headlights seemed to be flickering strangely, creating unusual shadows in my mirrors. I adjusted the mirror to get a better look. What I saw made my blood freeze. There was something on top of Diego's trailer. At first I thought it was just cargo or a tarp come loose, but as I stared longer I realized it was moving, crawling. It looked like a person, but wrong, somehow distorted. The proportions weren't right, the limbs too long, too thin. And it was moving across the top of the trailer with a jerky, unnatural motion like a spider. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating from fatigue. When I looked again, the figure was still there, but closer to the front of Diego's truck now. The headlights behind me illuminated it, partially casting most of its form in shadow, but highlighting what appeared to be hands, no claws, gripping the metal of the trailer. "What the hell?" I whispered, knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. I increased my speed slightly, irrationally, hoping to put some distance between myself and whatever was on Diego's truck. But the Kenworth accelerated too, maintaining the same gap between us. I considered using the radio to warn Diego about the thing on his vehicle. But would he believe me? Would I believe it myself if our positions were reversed before I could decide? The creature moved again. It crawled to the edge of the trailer, and then impossibly began to climb down the front toward Diego's cab. The movement was fluid, yet wrong, like watching an insect move in human form. I caught glimpses of its body, thin, almost skeletal, covered in what looked like tattered cloth or perhaps withered skin. My rational mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. I was tired, my eyes were playing tricks, or the shadows from the headlights were creating an optical illusion. There couldn't actually be a creature crawling on Diego's truck. But as it reached the level of Diego's cab, it turned toward me. And though I couldn't make out its face clearly in the darkness, I could see enough to know that whatever this was, it wasn't human, not anymore. Where eyes should have been were just empty sockets, black holes that somehow still seemed to see. Its jaw hung open too wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Fear, unlike anything I'd ever known, gripped me. My foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine roaring as the truck picked up speed. I didn't care about safe driving anymore, I just needed to get away from that thing. But Diego's truck kept pace effortlessly. And now the creature had positioned itself on the hood of his cab, still facing toward me. Those empty eye sockets somehow fixed on me despite the distance and darkness between us. With shaking hands, I grabbed the radio transmitter. Diego, can you hear me? There's something on your truck, on the hood of your cab." Static answered me. But then Diego's voice came through calm and clear. "I know." Those two words sent ice through my veins. He knew. How could he be so calm with that monstrosity perched on his hood? "What is it?" I asked, voice trembling. "What the hell is that thing?" A long pause followed, filled only with static. Then Diego's voice again, still unnervingly calm. "You can see it too." My heart nearly stopped. The implication of his question was clear. He had been seeing this thing for some time. This wasn't new to him. "Yes, I can see it." I nearly shouted into the transmitter. "What is it?" Another pause, then a sound came through the static that might have been a sigh or a laugh. It was hard to tell. "I don't know what it is," Diego finally replied. "It showed up about 3 years ago. Started following me on certain stretches of road, always the same ones. This highway is one of them." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. 3 years he had been driving with that thing following him for 3 years. "Why didn't you tell me back at the gas station?" I demanded. "Would you have believed me?" His voice was resigned, weary. "Besides, no one else has ever been able to see it before. I thought it was just my burden to bear." I glanced in the mirror again. The creature was still there, but now it had turned to face Diego's windshield instead of me. I could see its silhouette against the glow of Diego's dashboard lights, a hunched, emaciated figure with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. "What does it want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure Diego would know the answer. "I don't know that either," he replied. "It never comes inside the cab, never tries to harm me. It just watches, follows. Sometimes it disappears for weeks. Then it's back like it never left." "We need to stop," I said. "Find a priest or someone who knows about these things." Diego's laugh came through the radio, a hollow sound devoid of humor. "You think I haven't tried? I've visited churches, consulted curanderos, performed every ritual and cleansing ceremony I could find. Nothing works. It always comes back." As we continued down the highway, the creature remained perched on Diego's hood, occasionally shifting position, but never moving away. I kept expecting it to suddenly leap toward my truck, but it seemed content to stay with Diego. "How do you live like this?" I asked after a long silence. "How do you keep driving knowing that thing is out there waiting for you?" "What choice do I have?" Diego replied. "This is my livelihood. I can't stop driving because of some supernatural hitchhiker. After a while, you almost get used to it." Almost. The resignation in his voice chilled me more than the creature itself. The acceptance of horror as part of everyday life that was truly terrifying. We drove on through the night, the bizarre convoy of 2 trucks and 1 monstrous passenger continuing down the empty highway. Eventually, I saw signs indicating we were approaching Poza Rica. Civilization with its streetlights and other vehicles would soon be upon us. "What happens when we reach the city?" I asked Diego. "Will it disappear?" "Usually," he confirmed. "It doesn't like populated areas. Too many eyes, maybe. Too much light. It'll be gone until the next time I drive a lonely stretch of road at night." Sure enough, as the distant glow of Poza Rica appeared on the horizon, I watched in the mirror as the creature became increasingly agitated. It moved restlessly on the hood of Diego's truck, its movements becoming more jerky and erratic. Then, just as we passed the first roadside buildings marking the outskirts of the city, it suddenly reared up impossibly tall against the night sky and leaped off the truck not toward me but toward the darkness of the fields alongside the highway. In seconds it had vanished as if it had never been there at all. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The tension that had knotted every muscle in my body began to ease, though the memory of those empty eye sockets staring at me remained vivid. Diego's voice came through the radio once more. "It's gone now. Until next time." "What is it, Diego?" I asked again. "Not what it looks like, but what it is." "Where did it come from? Why does it follow you?" There was a long pause before he answered. "I have a theory," he said finally, "but you won't like it. Tell me anyway." "I think—" Diego hesitated. "I think it's what happens to us, to truckers who die on the road. We spend so much time out here, our souls get attached, but not to our trucks, to the road itself. When we die, especially if it's sudden an accident, a heart attack at the wheel, we don't know how to leave. So we become that." A chill ran through me at his words. It was a horrible thought that the twisted creature I had seen could once have been a human being, a fellow driver. "That's just a theory," I said, trying to convince myself as much as respond to him. "Maybe," Diego acknowledged. But I've been driving this route for 35 years. I've known dozens of truckers who disappeared on these highways, never found. And I've seen old photos of some of the ones who died in accidents. One of them, he looked a lot like that thing before death twisted him. We drove in silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts as we entered Poza Rica proper. The city streets were mostly deserted at this hour, but the street lights and occasional passing car were comforting reminders of normality after the otherworldly experience on the highway. At a traffic light, Diego's truck pulled alongside mine. Through our side windows, we could see each other clearly for the first time since the gas station. The change in his appearance shocked me. He looked decades older than he had just hours before, his face, deeply lined eyes sunken with a haunted look that hadn't been there earlier. He raised a hand in greeting, then pointed ahead, indicating he was turning off at the next intersection. I nodded, returning the gesture. As the light turned green, Diego's truck rumbled ahead and then right, disappearing around a corner, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I completed my delivery that morning and spent the day in Poza Rica, too shaken to begin the return journey immediately. I needed time to process what I had seen to decide whether I could continue in this profession, knowing what might be out there on the dark highways. That evening I went to a local cantina frequented by truckers, hoping to hear stories, maybe find some explanation or context for my experience. I didn't explicitly ask about creatures on the highway. I wasn't ready to be labeled as crazy or drunk, but I did inquire about Diego Herrera, wondering if others knew him and his story. The responses were unexpected. Diego Herrera, an older driver, repeated, frowning. With the blue Kenworth, I nodded, describing Diego and his truck. The man exchanged glances with his companions. Amigo Diego Herrera died 3 years ago. Heart attack while driving somewhere on the Mexico-Tuxpan highway. His truck went off the road, wasn't found for days. My blood ran cold. That's impossible. I just saw him last night. We had coffee together at a gas station. The man shrugged. Maybe it's a different Diego Herrera. But the one I knew, the one we all knew, he's been dead for 3 years. I left the cantina in a daze, my mind reeling. Had I imagined the entire encounter? Was I so tired that I hallucinated both Diego and the creature? But no, the sinkhole had been real. Someone had warned me about it over the radio. Back in my motel room, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's eyeless face staring at me. And now, overlaid on that image, was Diego's weathered face with its haunted eyes. 3 years, he had said. The creature had been following him for 3 years. The same amount of time since the real Diego Herrera had reportedly died. When dawn came, I checked out of the motel and prepared for the return journey. I considered taking a different route, avoiding the Mexico-Tuxpan highway entirely. But something drew me back to that road, a need to confirm or deny what had happened, to make sense of the inexplicable. I drove cautiously, hyper-aware of every shadow, every movement in my peripheral vision. The highway looked different in daylight, just an ordinary stretch of road, unremarkable and unthreatening. It was hard to reconcile this mundane reality with the nightmare of the previous night. As I approached kilometer 157, I slowed down, looking for the sinkhole. It was there, just as I remembered it, though road crews had now placed warning cones around it and were beginning repairs. So that at least had been real. I stopped at the same gas station where I had met Diego. The attendant didn't remember seeing me with another trucker the night before, but he admitted he had been busy and didn't pay much attention to the customers. On the final stretch of my return journey, as night fell once more, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see Diego's Kenworth appear behind me, the creature perched atop it. But the road remained empty, and I reached my destination without incident. I told no one about what I had experienced. Who would believe me? Instead, I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it had been a hallucination brought on by fatigue and isolation. But deep down I knew what I had seen was real, or at least as real as anything supernatural can be. Weeks passed. I continued driving, though I avoided the Mexico-Tuxpan highway when possible, especially at night. When assignments required me to take that route, I did so during daylight hours with the radio turned up loud to drown out my thoughts. Then, one night, circumstances forced me onto that highway after dark. A delay at the loading dock, a mechanical issue that took hours to resolve, and a deadline that couldn't be missed all conspired to put me back on that straight, empty stretch of road under a moonless sky. As before, there were no other vehicles. The radio produced only static. My cell phone showed no signal. It was just me and the darkness. For hours, nothing happened. I began to relax, to think that perhaps the previous incident had been a one-time event, a brief window into something beyond normal experience that had now closed permanently. Then I saw it. Not in my mirrors this time, but through my windshield. A dark shape on the road ahead, illuminated by my headlights. At first I thought it was an animal, a dog or coyote perhaps, but as I drew closer it resolved into a human figure standing in the middle of my lane. I slammed on the brakes, the heavy truck skidding slightly before coming to a halt about 20 meters from the figure. My headlights illuminated it clearly now, a man in trucker's clothing, his back to me, seemingly oblivious to the massive vehicle that had nearly run him down. "Hey!" I shouted, though of course he couldn't hear me from inside the cab. "Get out of the road!" The figure didn't move. With a muttered curse, I put the truck in park, turned on my hazard lights, and climbed down from the cab. The night air was unnaturally cold, just as it had been during my encounter with Diego and the creature. "Señor," I called as I approached. "You can't stand here, it's dangerous." Still no response. The man remained motionless, his back to me. As I drew closer, I noticed something odd about his posture, too stiff, somehow wrong. And his clothes, they looked old-fashioned, like something from decades ago. A terrible suspicion began to form in my mind. I slowed my approach now, only a few meters away. "Hello?" I said, my voice dropping to little more than a whisper. The figure began to turn slowly, mechanically, like something that had forgotten how human bodies are supposed to move. As his profile came into view, I saw that half his face was missing, torn away, in what must have been a horrific accident. The remaining eye swiveled to focus on me, and what was left of his mouth twisted into a grotesque approximation of a smile. I stumbled backward, nearly falling in my haste to retreat. The thing took a step toward me, then another. It didn't walk so much as lurch, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. I turned and ran back to my truck, scrambling into the cab and locking the doors. Through the windshield, I could see the figure still approaching, now illuminated fully by my headlights. Its damage was even more apparent, not just the face, but the entire right side of its body seemed crushed and mangled, yet somehow still functioning. My hands shook as I put the truck in gear. I considered trying to drive around the figure, but the highway was narrow at this point, with steep ditches on either side. I would have to go through it. "It's not real," I told myself. "It can't be real. It can't hurt you." But as I remembered the creature on Diego's truck, I wasn't so sure. What if these things could harm the living? What if the stories of phantom hitchhikers causing accidents were true? The figure had nearly reached my truck now. It stood directly in front of me, that single eye staring up at me through the windshield. Then, with a movement too quick for something so damaged, it leaped onto the hood of my truck. I yelled in terror, instinctively throwing the truck into reverse and backing up rapidly. The figure clung to the hood, its mangled fingers digging into the metal with impossible strength. The eye never left mine, holding me in its gaze as if trying to communicate something beyond words. In desperation, I slammed on the brakes, hoping the sudden stop would dislodge it. The truck screeched to a halt, but the figure remained firmly attached to the hood. Now it began to pull itself forward, crawling toward the windshield, toward me. I threw the truck into drive and floored the accelerator. The sudden forward motion finally had an effect. The figure lost its grip and tumbled off the hood. Without looking back, I sped down the highway, pushing the truck to its limits. In my side mirror, I caught a final glimpse of the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. Then it stepped off the pavement and vanished into the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached a populated area, a small town with streetlights and people and blessed normality. I pulled into a gas station, hands still shaking, sweat soaking my shirt, despite the cool night air. As I sat there trying to calm my racing heart, my radio suddenly crackled to life. Attention all drivers on Mexico-Tuxpan kilometer 157. There's a large pothole, no more like a sinkhole, opened up in the middle lane. Nearly lost control. Be careful if you're heading that way. It was Diego's voice, the exact same message I had heard on my previous journey, word for word. "Diego," I said into the transmitter. "Diego Herrera, is that you?" No response came, only static. I tried again, calling his name, asking where he was, but the radio remained silent except for the persistent hiss of empty airwaves. Then, just as I was about to give up, a different voice came through, unfamiliar, younger, with a slight accent from the north. "Who are you looking for, amigo? There's no Diego Herrera on this channel." "He just issued a warning," I insisted, "about a sinkhole at kilometer 157. "There's no sinkhole there," the voice replied. "I just passed that section an hour ago. Road's clear." "But I heard him," I said, knowing how crazy I must sound. "Just now." "The only one broadcasting in the last 20 minutes is you," the voice said. "Maybe you should get some rest, companero. The road plays tricks on tired minds." The radio went silent again. I sat there trying to make sense of what was happening. Had I imagined Diego's warning this time? Was the sinkhole gone now, repaired perhaps? But I had seen the road crews working on it earlier that same day, unless time itself was somehow distorted on that highway. The thought was too bizarre to contemplate, yet it aligned with the strangeness I had experienced. Diego warning me about a sinkhole that hadn't happened yet, or had already been fixed, or existed in some parallel timeline. I didn't sleep that night. I drove straight through to my destination, delivered my cargo at dawn, and then went to my company's local office. I told them I was taking a leave of absence effective immediately. "Family emergency," I said. They weren't happy, but they agreed to 2 weeks. I spent those 2 weeks researching. I looked into Diego Herrera's death, confirming that he had indeed died of a heart attack while driving his Kenworth on the Mexico-Tuxpan highway 3 years earlier. I found records of other truckers who had died or disappeared on that same stretch of road, more than could be explained by normal accident statistics. And I looked into the folklore surrounding the highway. Local communities had stories going back generations about the road being haunted, about strange creatures that followed travelers, about time moving differently in certain sections. Most chillingly, there were accounts of people encountering earlier versions of themselves, past or future selves, driving the same routes in an endless loop. When my leave of absence ended, I returned to driving, but with one firm condition: I would never again travel the Mexico-Tuxpan highway, especially not at night. My company agreed, rerouting my assignments to avoid that area entirely. For several months, this arrangement worked well. I began to convince myself that what I had experienced had been some kind of shared hallucination, perhaps even a minor psychotic episode brought on by isolation and fatigue. The human mind, after all, is capable of creating vivid, seemingly real experiences when pushed to its limits. Then came the assignment I couldn't refuse, a special delivery time-sensitive with a substantial bonus, the only viable route, Mexico-Tuxpan. I considered quitting on the spot, but the money was too good, and a part of me, the part that had driven trucks for 25 years through all kinds of dangers, refused to be ruled by fear. Besides, I told myself I would travel during daylight hours only. Whatever haunted that highway seemed strongest at night. The outbound journey went smoothly. Bright sunshine, other vehicles on the road, nothing unusual except for my own tension. I passed kilometer 157, no sinkhole in sight, just smooth pavement. I even stopped at the same gas station where I had met Diego, finding it mundane and unthreatening in the light of day. But my return journey was delayed. A traffic accident blocked the highway for hours. By the time I could proceed, the sun was setting. I considered waiting until morning, but my deadline wouldn't allow it. I had no choice but to drive that straight, lonely stretch of highway at night once more. As darkness fell completely, the familiar pattern reasserted itself. Other vehicles became scarce, then vanished entirely. The radio produced only static. My cell phone lost signal. The temperature in the cab dropped noticeably, despite the heater running at full blast. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes constantly scanning the road ahead, the mirrors, the darkness to either side. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of wind sounded like whispers. "There's nothing out there," I told myself firmly. "Nothing real anyway, just keep driving." For over an hour, nothing happened. The highway remained empty, the night quiet, except for the rumble of my engine. I began to relax slightly, to think that perhaps the curse, or whatever it was, had run its course. Then I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. They were far behind, but approaching rapidly. My first reaction was relief. Another vehicle, another human being in this isolated stretch. But as the headlights drew closer, a familiar pattern of light made my stomach clench with dread. It was a Kenworth, an old Model Blue Diego's truck. "Not possible," I whispered. "Not possible." But there it was, gaining on me with unnatural speed. Soon it was close enough that I could see details in my mirrors, the specific pattern of running lights, the slight dent in the front bumper, the faded company logo on the door. It was identical to the truck Diego had been driving during our previous encounter. I increased my speed irrationally, hoping to outrun whatever was behind me. But the Kenworth accelerated too, maintaining the distance between us, not trying to catch up, just following, watching. I glanced at the top of the trailer in my mirror, expecting to see the creature perched there as before. But the trailer was empty, no twisted figure crawling across its surface. Somehow this was even more unnerving. Where was it? Had it already moved to the cab? Was it inside with Diego, or was it somewhere else entirely? A movement in my peripheral vision made me jerk my head to the right. There, outside my passenger window, keeping pace with my truck despite my speed of over 100 kilometers per h, was the creature. It ran alongside my truck with impossible speed and grace, its limbs moving in ways that defied anatomy. Its eyeless face turned toward me, that too wide mouth opening in what might have been a grin or a snarl. As I watched in horror, it reached out one elongated arm, clawed fingers scraping against the door of my cab. I swerved left instinctively, nearly crossing into the oncoming lane before correcting. When I looked again, the creature was gone. But in my mirror, Diego's truck remained steadily following. My radio crackled suddenly, making me jump. "You see it now, don't you?" Diego's voice clear, as if he were sitting beside me. "You see what follows us on these roads?" "What does it want?" I shouted into the transmitter, fear making my voice crack. "Why is it chasing me?" "It doesn't chase," Diego replied calmly. "It follows. It's drawn to us, to drivers, to the loneliness, the isolation, the endless kilometers of empty road. We're already half ghosts out here, Raul. Separated from the world, existing in our own bubble of time and space. The creature just recognizes that." "How do I make it stop?" I demanded. "How do I get away from it?" A sound came through the radio, that same ambiguous noise that might have been a sigh or a laugh. "You don't. Not permanently. You can outrun it for a while, stay in cities, drive only during the day, take different routes. But eventually, if you keep driving these highways at night, it will find you again." "Like it found you," I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "You died on this road, Diego. 3 years ago, a heart attack while driving." Silence on the radio extending so long I thought the connection had been lost. Then very quietly, "Yes." "So what are you now?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "A ghost, a memory, a warning." "I don't know," Diego admitted. "I remember dying. The pain in my chest, the world going dark. Then I was back on the road in my truck as if nothing had happened. Except the creature was there following me, always following. And no one could see me except other drivers on this highway. At night." I glanced in my mirror again. The Kenworth was still there, headlights steady in the darkness. I could just make out a figure in the driver's seat, Diego, or whatever remained of him. And the sinkhole? I asked. Was that real? Yes, Diego said. It formed the night I died. My truck went off the road there into the ditch. They found me 3 days later. The sinkhole appears and disappears now. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Like me. Why are you telling me this? Why warn me about the sinkhole, make contact with me specifically? Another long pause before Diego answered. Because you're like me, Raul. Or you will be. The creature doesn't just follow drivers. It chooses them, marks them, and when their time comes, they join the highway. Forever. A cold dread settled in my stomach. What do you mean, like you, I'm alive, I'm real? For now, Diego said. But the creature has chosen you. I've seen it happen before. First it follows, then it touches, then it claims. I remembered the clawed fingers scraping against my door. The touch had already happened. How long? I asked, my mouth dry with fear. How long do I have? I don't know, Diego replied. Days, weeks, not longer. The claiming comes suddenly. A mechanical failure, perhaps. A blown tire at high speed, or a heart attack like mine. However it happens, it will be on this highway, at night, and then you'll be like me, like us. Us, I repeated. There are more of you. Many more, Diego confirmed. We all drive these highways, forever, warning when we can, watching, waiting for the next to join us. As if to emphasize his words, I suddenly noticed more headlights in my mirrors. Not just Diego's truck now, but several vehicles, all trucks of various models and ages, some so old they looked like they belonged in museums. They formed a convoy behind me, a procession of the damned. No, I said, pressing the accelerator to the floor. I won't accept this. I'll quit driving, leave Mexico, go somewhere far from these highways. Diego's laugh came through the radio again, hollow and sad. Others have tried that. It doesn't work. Once the creature has touched you, has marked you, your fate is sealed. The road will call you back one way or another. The convoy of ghostly trucks continued to follow as I sped down the highway, my speedometer climbing dangerously high. I didn't care about safety anymore. I just needed to escape to outrun this nightmare. Ahead I could see lights, the outskirts of a town. Civilization. Safety, at least temporarily. The same town where I had stopped after my encounter with the mangled figure on the road. They're fading, Diego's voice said, growing distant and staticky. We can't follow you into populated areas. But remember, Raul, the creature will be waiting when you return to the dark highways, and so will we. I glanced in my mirror once more. The ghostly convoy was indeed fading, the trucks becoming transparent headlights dimming. By the time I reached the first street light of the town, they had vanished completely. I pulled into the same gas station where I had stopped before, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. I sat there for a long time, trying to process everything I had heard, everything I had seen. The creature, Diego's ghost, the convoy of dead truckers endlessly driving the highways they had died on, and my own fate apparently sealed the moment those clawed fingers had touched my truck. I didn't drive that night. I checked into a motel and lay awake until dawn, contemplating my options. I could quit driving immediately, sell everything, move to another country. But Diego's words haunted me. The road will call you back. In the morning I called my company and resigned. I told them I was having health problems, which wasn't entirely a lie. The constant fear, the sleepless nights, the stress of knowing what awaited me on the dark highways, it was all taking a physical toll. I returned to Mexico City, sold my possessions, and bought a bus ticket to Cancun. I would start a new life there, far from the highways that had been my home for 25 years. I would never drive again, never return to those lonely roads at night. For 6 months my plan worked. I found a job at a hotel, made new friends, even started dating a kind woman who didn't mind my occasional nightmares or reluctance to travel at night. I began to hope that perhaps Diego had been wrong, that I had escaped my fate. Then came the dreams. Night after night I found myself back on the Mexico-Tuxpan highway, driving a truck through endless darkness. Sometimes I was alone. Sometimes Diego's Kenworth followed me. Sometimes I saw the creature running alongside my truck, those eyeless sockets somehow fixed on me, that too-wide mouth grinning with anticipation. I would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, the sensation of movement still vibrating through my body. The dreams became more frequent, more vivid, until I was afraid to sleep at all. One night I woke from a particularly intense nightmare to find myself not in my bed, but in my car driving. I had no memory of getting up, dressing, or starting the vehicle, yet here I was on a dark highway, hands gripping the wheel, foot on the accelerator. I pulled over immediately, shaking with fear and confusion. I was on Highway 180 headed west toward Mexico City, toward the highway that had haunted my dreams. Somehow in my sleep I had acted on the compulsion to return. That was when I knew Diego had been right. The road was calling me back, and sooner or later I would answer. Whether awake or asleep, my body would find its way to those haunted highways, to the creature that had marked me to my destiny. I fought it for another month, using every method I could think of. I took sleeping pills. I had friends stay over to watch me. I even briefly considered having myself committed to a psychiatric hospital. Nothing worked. I would still find myself waking in my car, driving west, getting further each time before I could stop myself. Finally, I surrendered to the inevitable. If I was going to die on that highway, I would do it on my own terms. I quit my job, said goodbye to my girlfriend, and bought a used pickup truck. I would drive to Mexico City one last time, see my family, make peace with my past, and then I would face the Mexico-Tuxpan highway and whatever awaited me there. The journey to Mexico City was uneventful. I drove only during daylight hours, staying in motels at night. I spent a week with my family, not telling them the real reason for my visit, just saying I missed them and wanted to reconnect. On my final night in the city, I wrote letters to those I cared about, explaining as best I could without sounding insane. I left them with my sister to be delivered if anything happens to me. The next morning I set out for Tuxpan. My plan was to reach the haunted stretch of highway just as night fell. If my fate was to join Diego and the others, I would meet it head on, not running in fear. As I drove, I found myself strangely calm. The anxiety that had plagued me for months had given way to a fatalistic acceptance. Whatever happened tonight, it would be an end to the uncertainty, the waiting, the dread of what was to come. I reached kilometer 157, the site of the intermittently appearing sinkhole, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. I pulled over to the side of the road and waited for full darkness to descend, watching as the last colors faded from the sky, as the stars emerged one by one. When only the faint glow of my dashboard lights remained, I pulled back onto the empty highway and continued north. The radio immediately filled with static. My cell phone lost signal. The temperature in the cab dropped noticeably. I drove for an hour alone on the straight, endless road. No headlights appeared in my mirrors. No figures materialized alongside my truck. Just the darkness, the empty highway, and me. Had I been wrong? Had the creature lost interest in me? Had Diego's warnings been nothing but the hallucinations of a tired, stressed mind? Then I saw it, a shape on the road ahead, illuminated by my headlights. As I drew closer, it resolved into a figure. I recognized the mangled man standing in the middle of my lane just as before. I didn't stop this time. I didn't swerve. I kept driving straight toward the figure, accelerating rather than braking. "If you want me," I said aloud, "come and get me." The figure didn't move as my truck bore down on it. At the last possible moment, I closed my eyes, bracing for impact, for the sound of a body hitting metal, for whatever might come after. But there was nothing. No impact. No sound. When I opened my eyes, the road ahead was empty. The figure had vanished, or I had passed right through it. I laughed, a sound of borderline hysteria. Was that it? Was that the claiming Diego had warned me about a ghostly figure that couldn't even interact with the physical world? My laughter died in my throat as I checked my rearview mirror. The road behind me was no longer empty. Diego's blue Kenworth was there, headlights bright in the darkness, and behind it a convoy of trucks stretching into the distance, a parade of the dead and damned. I pressed the accelerator harder, though I knew now that I couldn't outrun them. They weren't trying to catch me. They were escorting me, welcoming me to their ranks. My radio crackled to life. "It's time, Raul," Diego's voice said softly. "The creature is ready to claim you." "Where is it?" I demanded, scanning the road, the mirrors, the darkness on either side. "I don't see it." "Look up," Diego replied. Against my better judgment, I tilted my head back, looking at the roof of my cab. Something moved there, a scratching sound like claws on metal. I couldn't see what was making it from my position, but I knew the creature was on my truck, just as it had been on Diego's that first night. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady despite the terror coursing through me. "Now you join us," Diego said, "one way or another." As if on cue, a sharp pain lanced through my left arm, radiating up into my jaw. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vise. A heart attack just like Diego. I fought to keep control of the truck as darkness crept in at the edges of my vision. The pain was excruciating, but I refused to give in, refused to let my truck careen off the road as Diego's had. With the last of my strength, I guided the truck to the side of the highway and brought it to a stop. The pain was unbearable now, my breath coming in short gasps. The darkness was closing and the world fading away. The last thing I remember seeing was my driver's side door opening, though I hadn't touched the handle. A figure stood there, not the mangled man, not the creature, but Diego himself, looking exactly as he had when I first met him at the gas station. "Welcome to the highway, amigo," he said, extending his hand to me. "We've been waiting for you." And then darkness. I don't know how much time passed before I was aware again. It might have been minutes or hours or days. When consciousness returned, I was sitting in my truck on the same stretch of highway at night. Everything looked the same, felt the same. But I knew immediately that something had changed fundamentally. I was no longer part of the world of the living. I tried my radio and it worked, but only to communicate with other trucks in the convoy, the other ghosts of the highway. Diego explained the rules of our existence. We could appear to living drivers under certain conditions. We could warn them of dangers when possible. We could interact with the physical world in limited ways. And the creature, the thing that had marked me, claimed me, it now followed all of us, a constant reminder of our state, of the barrier between us and the living world. Not a monster to be feared anymore, but a companion in our endless journey. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've driven this highway every night, part of the spectral convoy, invisible to most living eyes. Sometimes we encounter a driver who can see us, usually someone the creature has already marked. Sometimes we can warn them of real dangers like sinkholes or washouts. Sometimes we can only watch as they drive toward their own inevitable end. And sometimes on the darkest nights, when the loneliness of the highway becomes too much to bear, we appear to those who don't yet know what awaits them. We remind them that the roads of Mexico have always been haunted, that for every living driver passing through the night, there are dozens of us keeping pace with them, watching from the darkness. So, if you find yourself on the Mexico-Tuxpan highway at night, and you see a convoy of trucks in your mirror that wasn't there a moment before, or if you feel a sudden, unexplainable chill in your cab, know this: you are not alone. We are with you. We have always been with you. And the third passenger, the one that rides atop your trailer, that scratches at your roof, that waits to claim you for the endless highway, it is with you too. Listen for its claws on the metal of your truck. Watch for its reflection in your mirrors. And when the pain comes, when your time has finally arrived, don't fight it. Accept it. Join us. The highway is waiting.